Winston Churchill was 39 years old when he signed off on the plan that would destroy his career, kill 130,000 men, and accidentally birth the national identity of two countries that had never fought a war before. He called it a shortcut. The generals who inherited the wreckage called it something considerably less polite. And the young men from Queensland and Canterbury and County Cork, who climbed out of wooden boats onto a wrong beach in the dark, staring up at cliffs nobody had told them would be there, called it nothing at all, because most of them were already dead or bleeding before the sun had fully risen on the 25th of April, 1915. There is a particular cruelty to campaigns that fail at the concept level, where the idea itself is broken before the first soldier laces his boots. Gallipoli is one of those. And the more I pulled apart the planning documents and the logistics records from early 1915, the more it became clear that the catastrophe was not manufactured by bad luck alone. It was built, deliberately, from the wrong materials, by men who were too certain too quickly, and who confused strategic elegance with operational reality. The gap between those two things cost more than 250,000 human casualties across 8 months and 25 days. The logic Churchill sold to the War Council in January 1915 was, on a map, seductive. The Western Front had already stalled into its frozen geometry of trenches. Russia was hemorrhaging men on the Eastern Front with no relief in sight. If the Allies could force the Dardanelles, the narrow 38-mile strait dividing European and Asian Turkey, their ships could steam directly to Constantinople, shell the Ottoman capital into capitulation, knock Turkey out of the war entirely, open a warm water supply route to Russia, and swing the whole strategic weight of the conflict in a single, elegant stroke. The plan was not without genuine merit as a concept. What it was without was honest intelligence, adequate naval force, and a realistic accounting of what would happen when Ottoman gunners and minefields entered the calculation. The naval attempt came first. On the 18th of March, 1915, a combined Anglo-French fleet of 18 battleships drove into the Dardanelles Strait with orders to punch through. By the time the smoke cleared, 3 battleships had been sunk by a line of 26 mines that had been quietly laid in an unswept corridor of water. 3 more capital ships were so badly damaged they had to be withdrawn. The attack stalled in the course of a single afternoon. The Ottomans, who had been on the verge of requesting a ceasefire that morning, their ammunition was critically low, their forts were crumbling, watched the Allied fleet turn around and sail back out. The Admiralty would not learn until after the war how close the strait had been to falling. They retreated exactly 1 afternoon before victory. That naval failure should have ended the campaign. Instead, it triggered the decision to land ground troops, as though the place to fix a broken naval plan was to add 50,000 soldiers to it. The men who would do that landing were drawn from Britain, France, India, and 2 young Dominion nations that had never committed forces to a major war, Australia and New Zealand. Roughly 16,000 Australians and New Zealanders went ashore in the pre-dawn darkness of the 25th of April, 1915, at a narrow shelf of beach on the western coast of the Gallipoli Peninsula. They were supposed to land at a wider, flatter beach 1 mile to the south, near Gaba Tepe. The currents pulled them off course. Instead of an accessible beach with manageable terrain, they scraped ashore beneath cliffs and ridges that climbed to approximately 300 feet. Terrain so broken and vertical that a man carrying a rifle and 60 pounds of equipment could barely stand upright, let alone advance. By the end of that first day, 620 Australians were dead, 2,000 more were wounded, and the ANZAC forces had clawed their way to a beachhead approximately 1 kilometre deep that they would not significantly expand for the next 8 months. What kept them from being pushed back into the sea in those first terrible hours was a defensive decision made by a 34-year-old Ottoman commander named Mustafa Kemal. He was in temporary command of a reserve division and had received no orders to engage the landing force. He went anyway. Ordering his 57th Infantry Regiment forward to the high ground above the beach, he told them something that has since become one of the most quoted commands in military history. Men, I am not ordering you to attack. I am ordering you to die. In the time that it takes us to die, other forces and commanders can come forward and take our places. Every man in that regiment died. The high ground held. Mustafa Kemal would go on to lead the Turkish Republic. His men's deaths above ANZAC Cove bought him the time to do it. What settled in after that first bloody morning was a siege, not the clean, decisive breakthrough Churchill had envisioned, but a grinding, disease-ridden, sun-hammered stalemate, where both sides held their positions through sheer institutional refusal to yield them. Of the estimated 213,000 British casualties across the entire Gallipoli Campaign, 145,000 came not from Turkish bullets, but from illness. Dysentery, enteric fever, the particular violence of summer heat on open wounds, in a peninsula with almost no shade, and water so scarce that men rationed their drinking against the sound of their own thirst. In November, the weather collapsed in the other direction. A violent blizzard froze soldiers at their positions without warning, and over 16,000 troops were evacuated in the subsequent days with frostbite and exposure. Frostbite and dysentery in the same campaign 8 months apart. The Ottoman Empire, for its part, did not have it easier. Turkish and Arab forces suffered an estimated 300,000 casualties defending Gallipoli, of whom over 87,000 died. They were defending ground they understood intimately, their roads, their ridgelines, their own coastline, against an attacker who had arrived via a plan drafted mostly by men who had never seen the peninsula. That asymmetry ran through every engagement from the first day to the last. The evacuation that finally ended the campaign in January 1916, 80,000 men quietly extracted over several nights using decoy rifle contraptions that fired automatically after the troops had gone, leaving the Ottoman forces believing positions were still occupied, was, grotesquely, the most flawlessly executed operation the entire campaign ever produced. The only chapter of Gallipoli that worked precisely as planned was the one where everyone left. There is still so much of this story we haven't touched. The August offensive that came so close to cracking the Ottoman line. The political earthquake that detonated back in London when the campaign collapsed and Churchill was stripped of his Admiralty posting. What this 8-month failure actually did to Australian and New Zealand identity in ways that no victory could have achieved. And the question that military historians are still arguing over, whether, on the 18th of March 1915, one more hour of nerve from the Allied fleet commander would have changed the entire course of the war. That's all ahead. So if you're lying down right now, if the room is dark and the day is finally quiet, let yourself sink into it. This story doesn't need you sharp. It works just as well when you're halfway between waking and sleep, because it's the kind of history that settles into you slowly, the kind where the weight of what happened becomes clear not all at once, but in layers. This is the entire history of the Gallipoli Campaign. Chapter 1. The Room Where It Was Decided. There is a specific kind of silence that precedes catastrophe. Not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of a room full of powerful men who have privately decided they are not going to be the one who says no. That silence settled over a meeting room in Whitehall on the 13th of January, 1915, and what grew from it, slowly, bureaucratically, with all the procedural tidiness of a government at war, was the most expensive military miscalculation in the history of the British Empire. The man recording that silence was Maurice Hankey. He was the secretary of the War Council, which meant he sat at the edge of every critical meeting, not as a participant, but as the official voice of institutional memory, the man responsible for writing down what was said, what was decided, and what was conspicuously left unresolved. If you want to understand how the Gallipoli Campaign was born, you don't start with Winston Churchill's famous energy or Lord Kitchener's famous mustache. You start with Hankey's minutes, because the minutes tell a story that no memoir ever quite dares to tell plainly. The story of a committee that approved a plan while almost none of its members actually believed in it. Churchill was then the First Lord of the Admiralty, which made him responsible for the Royal Navy, and, in his own formidable estimation, for a great deal more besides. He was 40 years old. He was brilliant, combative, and in the grip of a strategic idea that had been forming in his mind since the Western Front had hardened into stalemate in the autumn of 1914. The trenches in France were consuming men and producing nothing. Churchill, with the characteristic confidence of a man who has rarely been told he is wrong in a way that stuck, had begun looking for a different door. The Dardanelles, the narrow strait connecting the Aegean Sea to the Sea of Marmara, guarded by Ottoman forts on both European and Asian shores, looked to him like that door. Force it open with the navy, steam through to Constantinople, knock the Ottoman Empire out of the war, relieve pressure on Russia, change everything. The idea was not insane. It was, in fact, a serious strategic concept. The problem was not the idea. The problem was everything that came after. When Churchill presented the plan to the War Council on the 13th of January, the room included some of the most experienced military and political minds in Britain. Lord Kitchener, the Secretary of State for War, was present. Lord Fisher, the First Sea Lord and the professional head of the Royal Navy, was present. Prime Minister Asquith was present, and what Hankey's minutes record, with the flat, procedural prose of a man who was paid to be precise and not to editorialize, is something that should make anyone who has ever sat in a meeting feel a cold recognition. The plan was discussed. It received what the minutes describe as general approval. Lord Fisher did not formally endorse it, but Lord Fisher also did not formally object. He said, according to the record that Churchill himself later reproduced in his memoir, The World Crisis, that he had understood that this question was not to be raised today. And then, apparently, he sat back down. That sentence, had understood that this question was not to be raised today, is 8 words. I've read those 8 words more times than I can count, and each time they strike me as the most consequential passive resistance in British military history. Fisher knew the plan was wrong. He had written a private memorandum. It exists in the Fisher Papers at Churchill College, Cambridge, in which he predicted, with reasonable accuracy, that a naval-only assault would fail and would eventually require land troops to finish what the ships started. He knew. He did not say so in the room where it would have counted. He lodged a procedural complaint about the agenda. He sat down, and the catastrophe was set in motion. There were reasons for Fisher's silence that had nothing to do with cowardice. He was in a complicated institutional relationship with Churchill, a younger man of ferocious authority, and the relationship between the professional naval head and the political head of the Admiralty had always been tense. Fisher was in his mid-70s. He was working within a system that rewarded consensus and punished dissenters who couldn't muster a majority. He also, it must be said, later changed his mind about the plan at least twice more before the naval attack actually occurred. But in that room, on that day, when the record needed his objection and history needed his voice, he gave the council a complaint about the schedule and called it a day. A second War Council meeting, on the 28th of January, was, if anything, more revealing. By this point, Fisher's reservations have become, in private, considerably more explicit. Asquith knew about them. The Prime Minister's correspondence with Venetia Stanley, which was not intended for any public eye, records Asquith noting that Fisher was very much perturbed by the plan. Asquith managed the meeting by bringing Fisher and Churchill into a private conversation before proceedings began. What was said in that conversation has never been definitively established. What came after it was that Fisher, once again, did not formally object in the council chamber. His memoirs, written years later, describe him rising to leave the room in protest and being personally restrained by Kitchener. The official minutes record no such drama. Both documents cannot be entirely right, and I find myself trusting the minutes. Hankey had no motive to protect anyone, and Fisher, a decade removed from the event, had every motive to reconstruct his own prescience. What the Council produced from these meetings was an operational plan that the Admiralty staff spent 2 weeks assembling. It ran to 47 pages. It detailed the ships, the bombardment sequence, the coordination with Russian forces in the Black Sea. What it did not contain, and this is the detail that I find myself returning to every time I think about this campaign, was any serious planning for what would happen if the naval attack stalled. There was no alternative plan. There was no land force contingency document. There was a 47-page argument for optimism, and at its base was the assumption that the first phase would work, because the alternative was too complicated to think about. The outer Ottoman forts at the entrance to the strait were bombarded on the 19th of February, 1915, and they fell within hours. HMS Inflexible's action report from that day records the forts as effectively silenced. Churchill, in London, sent a cable to his wife. His plan was unfolding. Here is what the ease of that first bombardment actually did. It confirmed every best-case assumption that every optimist in the planning process had been quietly carrying. It made the next, harder step feel inevitable rather than improbable. It silenced, temporarily but decisively, the remaining institutional doubters. The outer forts were old, fixed, and poorly equipped. The inner defences of the strait were none of those things. But in February of 1915, the difference between those two facts had not yet been paid for in ships and men. The War Council looked at the smoke rising from the Ottoman positions, looked at the clean lines of its 47-page plan, and did not ask the question that needed asking. What if this is the easy part? That question would be answered on the 18th of March. But that answer required several more weeks of institutional confidence to deliver itself. And in the room where it was decided, Whitehall, the 13th of January, a secretary writing with a careful hand, a naval officer sitting back down, the structure of the answer was already in place. It had been built from silence, from procedural courtesy, from the particular social physics of a committee where no single person is willing to be the one who stops the machine. Organizational psychologists have a term for what happened in that room: pluralistic ignorance, the condition in which every individual privately doubts, but collectively assumes they are the only one who doubts, and so says nothing. The War Council of January 1915 didn't need malice to produce catastrophe. It needed a chairman who moved the agenda forward, a secretary who wrote down what was said, and a naval officer who phrased his deepest professional objection as a complaint about scheduling. That was enough. Chapter 2. The Geography of Catastrophe. The Gallipoli Peninsula is a strip of land roughly 60 kilometers long and between 5 and 15 kilometers wide, running in a rough southwest to northeast direction into the Aegean Sea, its eastern shore forming the western bank of the Dardanelles Strait. It is, in topographic terms, an extraordinarily hostile piece of ground for offensive military operations. The terrain is not merely difficult, it is functionally perfect for defense. A series of ridgelines and ravines, arranged as though specifically designed to trap an attacking force in a killing ground below the high ground, to deny observation, to funnel movement into predictable corridors, and to provide defenders with overlapping fields of fire across every approach. An attacker reading this landscape should feel the same sinking recognition that a farmer feels reading a forecast of frost. The critical fact, and the fact that never stops stinging when you look at the archival record, is that the British War Office already had this information. Survey maps of the peninsula existed. Ottoman survey work from 1906, supplemented by updated material from 1912, had been produced and filed. These were not rough sketches or approximate estimates. They were professional topographic surveys, marked with elevation contours, drainage patterns, and, notably, annotations indicating which terrain features were dominating. The ridge system known as the Kilid Bar Plateau, which rises to approximately 700 feet and commands the entire western shoreline of the peninsula below it, was marked in those documents as precisely the kind of ground that an enemy holding it would render the beaches beneath it untenable for any sustained force. The survey said, as clearly as a survey can say anything, "Beware of this ridge." Any force landing on the beaches below this ridge is, by the elementary geometry of topography, in a very difficult position. The maps were in London. What they were not, according to the documented record, was in the hands of the Mediterranean Expeditionary Force planning staff before the landings. The question of precisely why, whether it was administrative failure, logistics delay, or the extraordinary time pressure under which the MEF was assembled, remains not fully resolved. General Hamilton, who commanded the force, later wrote in his memoir that he had received almost no maps before the operation began. The War Office dispatch ledger tells a different story, recording dozens of map folios sent to his command between mid-March and mid-April of 1915. The two accounts can only be reconciled if Hamilton's staff received the maps and failed to distribute them downward through the command chain, which is either an administrative failure or a planning failure. Either way, the outcome was the same. Battalions going ashore on the 25th of April, 1915, below ridgelines that the survey had specifically identified as dangerous, without the detailed ground intelligence that might have shaped the plan. The Dardanelles Strait, at its narrowest point, is approximately 1.5 kilometers wide. This matters not as a navigational fact, but as a tactical one, because the narrowness is what made the minefield strategy viable. The Ottoman approach to defending the strait from naval assault was, in retrospect, elegant in its simplicity. They had studied British minesweeping doctrine, which was, in 1915, a fairly standardized practice involving sweeper vessels working in parallel lines, running with the prevailing current. The current in the Dardanelles runs strongly from north to south, toward the Aegean, at rates of between 2 and 4 knots. Standard sweeping doctrine assumed mines would be moored in lines running roughly parallel to the channel, which sweepers could clear by running their paravane wires across the current. What the Ottomans did, with German naval advice, was lay mines perpendicular to the current, across it, in a specific bay area after the British sweepers had already declared the parallel lines cleared. The mine barrier that would stop the Allied fleet on the 18th of March 1915 contained 26 mines. Manufacturing cost, a figure that historians have estimated at less than £2,000 sterling. Result: 3 Allied capital ships sunk or destroyed in 90 minutes. I want to stay with the terrain question for a moment longer, because it has a specific technical dimension that tends to get smoothed over in general accounts. The problem of artillery support on the Gallipoli Peninsula wasn't simply that the MEF didn't have enough guns, though it didn't. The problem was geometric. Naval gunfire in 1915 was designed to hit ships. It fired at low trajectories, essentially flat, optimized to hit a target at waterline level or just above. This is entirely useless against a fortified position dug into the reverse slope of a ridge, the side facing away from you. A ridge of 30 meters of height, standing 500 meters from the firing position, creates a zone of ground behind it of roughly 150 meters in depth that flat trajectory shells simply cannot reach. They pass over the ridge and land beyond the defensive position, or they hit the forward face of the ridge and absorb themselves harmlessly in the hillside. The only weapon capable of reaching reverse slope positions is the howitzer, which fires at steep angles to produce a plunging trajectory, the shell arriving from above rather than from the side. The MEF went to Gallipoli with 8 heavy howitzers for the entire operation. 8. against a peninsula where almost every major defensive position was dug into a reverse slope, because the defenders had had months to select exactly the positions that flat trajectory fire couldn't touch. The minesweeping force assembled for the Dardanelles operation is worth pausing on. It consisted of 21 converted North Sea fishing trawlers, with a combined displacement of roughly 9,400 tons. Their crews were predominantly civilian fishermen recruited from the Aegean, not naval mine warfare specialists. The current they were asked to sweep against ran at up to 3.5 knots, which was, for the underpowered trawlers towing paravane wires, at the edge of what was physically manageable. An Admiralty hydrographic chart from 1914 shows the current speeds in the strait with reasonable accuracy. Somebody had that chart. The minesweeping plan was approved anyway. These weren't unknowns. They were knowns that didn't change the plan. There is also the question of the landing site for the ANZAC force on the 25th of April, 1915. And this is a question I find genuinely difficult to resolve with the available evidence. The ANZAC landing, which was intended to take place on a relatively gentle gradient of beach, ended up occurring approximately 1.5 miles north of the intended position, at a point where the cliffs are among the steepest on that coastline, where the ravines running inland are almost vertical in places, and where the defending ridgeline sits close and commanding above the narrow strip of beach. Whether the boats were carried north by the Aegean current, or whether a last-minute navigation decision changed the approach, or whether something else entirely happened, has been argued about by military historians for over a century without complete resolution. What is not disputed, the men went ashore in the wrong place. And the wrong place was, topographically, almost as bad as it could have been. General Lehmann von Sanders, the German officer commanding the Ottoman Fifth Army defending the peninsula, had 19 days between the failed naval assault of the 18th of March and the Allied amphibious landing on the 25th of April. 19 days to move troops, to improve defences, to make educated guesses about where the landings would occur. He guessed correctly, not perfectly, but correctly enough, in part because the geography of the peninsula severely constrains where a large-scale amphibious landing is even physically possible. There are only a handful of beaches on the peninsula capable of receiving the volume of men and equipment the Allied plan required. Sanders moved 2 full divisions to cover the southern end of the peninsula and the Aegean coast. He worked from the same geography that the Allied planners had underestimated. The terrain didn't need to take sides. It simply was what it was, and one side had looked at it with serious professional attention, and one side had largely filed the relevant documents in London. 19th of February, the outer forts fell. 18th of March, the fleet was stopped. 25th of April, the infantry went ashore. Each of these dates follows from the last, not because of some grand strategic logic, but because, once the naval assault failed, the political and institutional momentum of the operation required a land assault to follow. Not because anyone had a credible plan for one, but because the alternative was to admit, before any boots had touched the beach, that the whole venture had already failed. And nobody in any committee room was going to say that. Not yet. Chapter 3. The 57th Regiment does not exist yet. On the morning of the 25th of April, 1915, a colonel in the Ottoman army did something that could have ended his military career in a court-martial. He moved his regiment forward without orders, against the position of his divisional commander, toward a ridge where he had no authority to go and no formal directive to hold. The regiment he commanded was the 57th Infantry, part of the 19th Division of the Ottoman Fifth Army. The colonel was Mustafa Kemal, and the decision he made in the first hours of that April morning, on a ridge above a beach full of landing soldiers, is one of the most consequential acts of individual military judgment in the war's entire history. It is worth being precise about what Kemal actually saw when he climbed to the summit of Chunuk Bair before dawn on the 25th. He was up there with a survey instrument, making his own assessment of the situation that his superior officers, still processing the reports flowing in from the beach, had not yet fully grasped. What he could see from that summit was the sea on two sides of the narrow peninsula, the Allied landing boats still in the water below, and the broad, exposed fact that if the soldiers climbing the cliffs below him reached this ridge before his forces did, the entire defensive logic of the peninsula collapsed. The Kilid Bar Plateau, the same ground the 1906 survey had marked as dominating, would be in Allied hands. The Strait forts could be taken from the rear. The fleet would pass. Constantinople would be threatened. The Ottoman position in Europe would be, in a very real tactical sense, finished. His divisional commander had ordered the 57th held in reserve. Kemal assessed the situation and decided the order was based on incomplete information. He moved the regiment forward. The Ottoman Fifth Army War Diary records the movement beginning at some point that morning. The exact time differs between sources, and it's an honesty worth flagging. Kemal's own account, recorded in 1918, places his decision at approximately 6 in the morning. The War Diary records it somewhat later. The discrepancy has never been fully reconciled by Turkish military historians, and it matters because it speaks to the degree to which Kemal later, and understandably, shaped the narrative of his own foresight. The 3 to 4 hour gap between his account and the diary's account either means his memory compressed the timeline, or the war diary was retrospectively assembled from incomplete notes, or both. I don't think this uncertainty diminishes what happened. It just makes it more honest. What happened is recorded clearly enough in the casualty figures. Of approximately 700 men in the 57th Infantry Regiment, who engaged Allied forces on the 25th of April, fewer than 250 survived the first week. The regiment was functionally destroyed. But the ridge held. The Allied forces, the ANZACs scrambling up the ravines from ANZAC Cove below, did not reach the summit in those first critical hours. When Kemal encountered retreating Ottoman soldiers who told him they were out of ammunition, he reportedly told them to fix their bayonets and lie down facing the enemy. He did not, in his own retelling, order them to attack. He ordered them to hold their position. The distinction mattered. They held long enough for reinforcements to come forward, and the window of Allied opportunity, which was real and wide in those first confused hours of the landing, began to close. The Allied intelligence picture on the 25th of April did not include Mustafa Kemal. He doesn't appear in Allied military intelligence reports until at least the 26th, when a captured prisoner identified him by name. For the first 36 hours of the campaign, the man directing the resistance that was systematically destroying the ANZAC timeline was, from the Allied perspective, essentially invisible. There is a strangeness in this, sitting with it now. The man who arguably saved the Ottoman defense, who would go on to found the Turkish Republic, who would later have an entire country named for him in all but name. On the morning that determined everything, he was not even a named figure in the enemy's intelligence files. He was an unauthorized colonel on a ridge, moving troops nobody told him to move, toward a position he had no orders to hold. The ceasefire of the 24th of May, 1915, tells you something important about what the campaign was like at ground level, something the official records don't quite capture, and the regimental war diaries only gesture at. By late May, the dead had been accumulating in no man's land between the ANZAC trenches and the Ottoman lines for nearly a month, in a climate that was already hot and getting hotter. The smell was, by every account from that period, beyond ordinary description. An armistice was negotiated, 9 hours, to bury the dead on both sides. An estimated 3,000 bodies were interred. Lieutenant Aubrey Herbert, a British officer attached to ANZAC headquarters, who spoke Turkish and served as an interpreter during the ceasefire, later described the scene in his memoir. Ottoman and ANZAC soldiers, he wrote, moved among the dead together. They shared cigarettes. They showed each other photographs. Some of the Turks wept openly. Herbert named none of them by full name. His account is too brief and too careful for that. But the image of two sets of men who had been trying to kill each other for 4 weeks, weeping together over shared photographs in no man's land, is one of those details that quietly refuses any simple story about what a war is. The Ottoman 57th Regiment was never reformed. By official Ottoman decree, it was honoured by dissolution, preserved in its destroyed state as an act of institutional memory. A regiment whose absence from the army list was itself the monument. This practice is unusual in military history, and it says something about how the Ottomans understood what the regiment had done. The Allied forces on the other side of the wire that day were developing their own understanding of what had happened to them, an understanding that would, over the following weeks and months, begin to take the shape of something quite different from a military defeat. That process was already beginning in the field notebooks and letters going home from ANZAC Cove. But it would require a specific architect to complete it, and that architect hadn't yet started writing. What Kemal's decision established, and this is the part that gets lost in the retrospective mythology of the great commander, is that the Ottoman defense of Gallipoli, in its first critical hours, was improvised. It was not the product of a superior plan. It was the product of one man at one ridge at one specific moment, making a decision that his superiors had not authorized, and which they were still, at the moment it was being executed, formally trying to reverse. The War Diary notation. Colonel Kemal has moved the 57th Regiment forward without orders. Divisional command has been informed, awaiting clarification, is among the most revealing documents I have found in any research into this campaign. Because what it captures is not a military machine operating at peak efficiency. It captures a bureaucracy almost losing a war in a morning while it waited for the paperwork to catch up with the crisis. Chapter 4. The Ledger of Beach West. The ships were packed wrong. That statement, which sounds almost comic in its simplicity, is the most precise description of what happened at Cape Helles on the 25th of April, 1915. And it had been decided weeks before any soldier set foot on any beach. The loading manifests for the transport vessels of the Mediterranean Expeditionary Force were determined by standard British Army loading doctrine, a set of procedures designed to optimize cargo stability and weight distribution on long voyages. This doctrine worked well for ships that were going to arrive at a port with proper unloading facilities, cranes, and adequate time. It did not work for ships running onto hostile beaches under fire, where the first thing you need is not necessarily the last thing you loaded. The collier River Clyde, a converted cargo ship that was to be beached deliberately below the cliffs of Sed El Bahr, on Beach 5 at Cape Helles, doors cut in her sides to allow soldiers to run out along gangplanks directly onto the beach, became one of the most documented catastrophes of the entire war. Commander Edward Unwin's after-action report to the Admiralty describes what happened at the gangways with a restraint that barely contains the horror underneath. The Turkish fire was so concentrated on the exit points that soldiers moving through the doors were killed before they could reach the end of the gangplank. Men stacked up in the ship's interior, pressing forward into fire that those ahead of them were absorbing. Within 35 minutes, hundreds of men were casualties. The beach was covered. The gangways became, according to eyewitness accounts, impassable. Loading manifest for transport ships supporting the Cape Helles landing. Column 4, row 17. 2 Maxim guns with ammunition wrapped in oiled canvas. Stowed in the lower hold. Depth, 18 feet of cargo above them. The men who needed those Maxim guns to suppress the machine gun positions at the wire on Beach West were dead or wounded before anyone could begin the process of unloading cargo to a depth of 18 feet. This wasn't malice. It wasn't incompetence in any personal sense. It was doctrine applied to the wrong situation. But the men on the beach didn't experience it as a procedural error. They experienced it as being cut down at wire they had no means to get through, without the fire support that was sitting at the bottom of a ship offshore. The Lancashire Fusiliers at Beach West on the morning of the 25th of April earned 6 Victoria Crosses before breakfast. It is the highest concentration of the Empire's highest military honour, awarded in a single action in a single morning. And the phrase used to describe it, 6 VCs before breakfast, has become one of those neat historical formulations that floats above the actual event. What the formulation doesn't carry is the detail in the battalion war diary. The wire that the Fusiliers were struggling through had been clearly visible in aerial reconnaissance photographs taken on the 18th of March, a month before the landing. Wire-cutting equipment had been loaded aboard a transport ship offshore. It was not unloaded on the 25th of April. The logistical staff officer's report later noted, with careful phrasing, that wire-cutting equipment had been available on shore by 1800 hours that day, 6 hours after the initial assault, after most of the casualties had already been taken. By the 30th of April, 5 days after landing, the MEF at Cape Helles had expended 57% of its 18-pounder shell allocation for the entire first month. The resupply chain from Alexandria required a minimum of 14 days. In the regimental war diaries from May through September of 1915, there is a recurring entry that, by the 4th or 5th time you encounter it, begins to feel like a kind of institutional scream. The phrasing varies slightly unit to unit, but the meaning is identical. Artillery support refused, insufficient shell stocks. Men were ordered forward without covering fire because the shells weren't there. And the shells weren't there because the formula used to calculate the monthly allocation was designed for the flat terrain of the Western Front, where guns could be aimed and fired on visible targets, not for a peninsula of ravines and reverse slopes, where every round had to work 3 times harder to achieve the same effect. The medical evacuation picture in those first 4 days requires its own separate accounting, because it represents a failure of planning that is, if anything, even more complete than the logistical failure at the beaches. Hospital ships had been allocated 3,000 beds for the combined landings. Within 72 hours of the first landing, 8,358 wounded men required evacuation. The Principal Director of Medical Services report, held at the Australian War Memorial, notes with an understatement so dry it almost disappears. Arrangements were found to be inadequate. The hospital ship Gascon departed for Alexandria on the 26th of April, carrying 1,200 patients on a vessel rated for 450. Wounded men lay on the beach at Cape Helles for periods of between 18 and 42 hours before evacuation could reach them. The allocation formula had assumed casualties consistent with a successful rapid advance. It had not accounted for a landing that stalled under wire on a defended beach in the first hour of the first morning. The fundamental infrastructure failure was piers. Standard British amphibious doctrine in 1915 assumed that pier structures capable of handling bulk supply would be constructed within approximately 48 hours of landing, using pontoon bridge sections carried by specialist Royal Engineer units. Piers are the difference between offloading 4 tons per lighter trip and offloading the quantities necessary to sustain offensive operations. At Cape Helles, the Royal Engineer pontoon equipment was aboard a specific transport vessel that was ordered to stand off the shore for 3 days because of Turkish artillery fire. Without piers, everything moved in open wooden lighters. Everything. Every shell, every bandage, every tin of bully beef, every gallon of water, every replacement rifle. A lighter carrying 4 tons taking 90 minutes for a round trip produced a daily supply ceiling that was, mathematically, insufficient for sustained movement. The pier decision, the decision to hold off the equipment necessary to build piers, was made because Turkish artillery fire was dangerous. Turkish artillery fire was dangerous because the MEF hadn't taken the high ground. The MEF hadn't taken the high ground because it didn't have the supplies to push forward. The The supplies couldn't come ashore because there were no piers. The circularity is complete, and it was apparent within 72 hours of landing. There is one detail about this campaign's logistical record that I find myself returning to almost against my will, because it is the kind of detail that converts abstract failure into something more immediate. Cecil Aspinall was the MEF staff officer primarily responsible for the loading manifests and ship-to-shore transfer planning at Cape Helles. His report on the logistical arrangements, submitted in May of 1915, is measured, professional, and contains the available by 1800 hours observation about the wire cutters. After the war, Aspinall served as the official compiler of the British official history of the Gallipoli Campaign. The man who planned the logistics wrote the first definitive public account of why the campaign failed. He is not listed as a contributor to the failure in his own account. This is not a conspiracy. It is just what happens when the people who made the decisions are also the people who write the history of those decisions. The documents remain in archives, saying something different. Chapter 5. Life at 180 vertical feet. Private John Simpson Kirkpatrick was, depending on which document you consult, a stretcher-bearer of the 3rd Field Ambulance, Australian Imperial Force, or a man without a clearly established unit attachment, who had, at some earlier point in his life, walked off a merchant ship in Australia to avoid returning to England, and who had subsequently enlisted in the AIF, possibly in part because the AIF offered a passage to the part of the world he wanted to be in. These two descriptions are not necessarily in conflict, but they produce a very different picture of who Simpson was from the polished national legend that has grown around him for over a century. The Australian War Memorial holds his service records. They are incomplete. The question of his precise unit status in the first days at ANZAC is not a trivial administrative footnote. It is the detail that explains why, in the 3rd Field Ambulance's war diary, the entry describing a man conducting unauthorized evacuation of wounded via Monash Valley on an Indian mule-core donkey describes him as unidentified. The terrain of Monash Valley needs to be described to understand what Simpson was doing every day for 24 days. The valley is a ravine running approximately 800 metres from the front line to the beach at Anzac Cove. The gradient averages roughly 35 degrees, steep enough that walking it in either direction is physically demanding, steep enough that 4 men carrying a single stretcher took approximately 45 minutes per trip and arrived at the bottom exhausted. Standard evacuation of wounded in that terrain required 4-man stretcher teams, and there were never enough of them. The valley was under regular sniper fire along its entire length, from positions in the ridges above, which meant a stretcher team presenting a slow-moving target of 4 men clustered around one stretcher was considerably more dangerous than a single man with a donkey moving at a steady, unpredictable pace. Simpson's method, loading a wounded man sideways across the donkey's back and walking him down to the beach at the animal's natural speed, was faster and, in the specific conditions of Monash Valley, arguably safer per casualty evacuated. He completed somewhere between 3 and 5 such trips each day, depending on which estimate you credit. Over 24 days, the numbers accumulate into something extraordinary. The 3rd Field Ambulance's medical officer, in a later account quoted in Peter Cochrane's careful biography of Simpson, described him as worth a company of stretcher-bearers in that particular ground. That is not a sentimental assessment from a grateful survivor. That is a professional military evaluation of an operational capacity. It is precise. It is the kind of precision that the legend tends to melt into warmth, and that the record insists on preserving. On the morning of the 19th of May, 1915, the Ottoman forces launched their largest assault on the Anzac perimeter, approximately 42,000 troops, attacking across the wire in the pre-dawn darkness. The assault was, by the end of the day, repulsed with heavy losses. By the morning of the 20th, the tactical situation was more stable than it had been for weeks. Simpson was walking up Monash Valley at approximately 8:30 that morning, returning for another trip, when a machine gun position in the heights above opened fire. He was killed by a single bullet. The wounded man he had loaded onto the donkey survived. The donkey, whom soldiers had been calling Murphy, though the animal had no official name in any record, was returned to the Indian Mule Corps and disappears from the historical record entirely. He had been at ANZAC for 24 days. The legend that built around Simpson after his death is, as legends are, a selective thing. He was born in South Shields, in the northeast of England, which made him not Australian in any birthplace sense. He was described by the enlistment medical examiner as healthy, with no defects, the standard language. He had left merchant ships behind in Australia, which, depending on how generously you read it, constituted either a practical decision or a breach of articles. Charles Bean, Australia's official war correspondent, recorded Simpson's story in the official history with measured precision, not as a saint, but as a man who found a method that worked and kept using it until he was killed. It was in the decades after the war that the story acquired its full symbolic weight, the specifically Australian quality, the retrospective insistence that he was essentially and necessarily one of our men, despite having been born in northeastern England, and despite the Army's own records being equivocal about his exact unit standing at any given moment. I want to be careful here about what I'm saying. The legend is not dishonest in its core. The man was real. What he did was real. The people he carried down the valley were real, and they survived because of him. And that matters, regardless of where he was born or whether his paperwork was in order. What the legend did, and what legends always do, was take a real and specific thing and make it stand for something larger than itself. Simpson became, in the post-war period, a vessel for a particular idea about what Australians were like under pressure. Resourceful, compassionate, irreverent of authority, willing to do what needed doing without waiting for orders. These are not invented qualities. You can find them in the unit diaries and the letters and the accounts of dozens of men across Anzac Cove. But they were assembled into a national character and projected backwards onto one specific man and one specific donkey. And the process of that assembly is almost as interesting as the man himself. The physical conditions at Anzac Cove in the summer of 1915 are documented in enough detail across enough sources that you can construct a reasonably precise picture of ordinary life in that position. And it is not a picture that historical distance has softened much. Men received approximately half a pint of water per day for all purposes, drinking, cooking, and washing, in temperatures that regularly reached above 33 degrees Celsius by July. The flies were, according to almost every diarist and letter writer from the period, beyond anything in their prior experience. The official AWM document on disease at Gallipoli, drawing on the regimental medical officer's reports, records the flies as the principal vector of the enteric epidemic that would, by late summer, be killing more men than Turkish bullets. A private in the 2nd Battalion, his diary is held at the AWM, wrote that eating had become a matter of opening your mouth as briefly as possible between spoonfuls. That is not a figure of speech. By June, the fly density in the trenches was documented as sufficient to turn meat black within minutes of exposure. The perimeter at its maximum extent covered approximately 400 acres, roughly the area of a large English farm. Within it lived approximately 17,000 men, 2 artillery batteries, multiple field hospitals, a water distillation plant, supply depots, and a system of saps and communication trenches extending roughly 24 kilometres in total. The smell of the position is described by almost every diarist who spent more than 2 weeks there. The specific combination of decay, chloride of lime used as disinfectant, salt water, mule dung, and the particular sweetness of an Aegean summer, almost nobody found a vocabulary for it. They wrote around it, "You would know the smell if you were here." which is, of course, both true and completely useless to anyone who wasn't. What they were living in was a space that had been converted, in 6 weeks, from an uninhabited stretch of coastal scrub to a city of 17,000 people with no running water, no sanitation, and an enemy sitting directly above it on the high ground the survey maps had marked as dominating. Chapter 6. Hamilton's Silence. Ian Hamilton kept a diary throughout the Gallipoli Campaign, and it is one of the most beautifully written documents produced by any senior commander in the First World War. He was a literary man in the truest sense, genuinely gifted, genuinely attentive to the texture of experience, capable of a sentence that stops you mid-paragraph and makes you read it again. The diary was later published as Gallipoli Diary in 2 volumes, and it has been read and cited and quoted for over a century. The problem is not the quality of the writing. The problem is what the quality of the writing reveals. When you read it alongside the staff communications and signals Hamilton was receiving at the same moments he was composing those sentences. On the 27th of April, 1915, 2 days after the landings, with the entire operation suspended in a precarious balance between 2 contested beachheads, Hamilton's diary devoted approximately 400 words to the colour of the Mediterranean at dawn. It then devoted 61 words to the question of whether reinforcements should be committed to the ANZAC position. The 61 words are, objectively, beautifully structured. They contain no decision. This is not an anomaly. It is characteristic. Across the diary's hundreds of pages, the proportionality between contemplative description and operational determination is consistently wrong in exactly this way. Wrong not because Hamilton was evasive, but because the same imaginative intelligence that allowed him to notice the light on the water at 5 in the morning was constitutionally resistant to the blunt, reductive, undeniable weight of military arithmetic. The crisis signal came at approximately 11 o'clock on the night of the 25th of April. General Birdwood, commanding the ANZAC Corps on the beach below, signalled Hamilton, who was aboard HMS Queen Elizabeth offshore, to report that the position was untenable and to recommend immediate re-embarkation. This was not a panicked assessment. Birdwood was not a panicky man. The signal reflected a genuine tactical assessment of a force that had gone ashore in the wrong place, was pinned below a ridge it couldn't take, and was taking casualties at a rate that threatened to consume it before dawn. Hamilton received the signal. He consulted his naval liaison. He waited, accounts suggest approximately 1 hour, and then sent his response. You have got through the difficult business. Now you have only to dig, 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 until you are safe. The decision to hold was, in the long retrospective view of most military historians, correct. The ANZAC perimeter held, was never broken, and became the base of operations for 8 months. But the correctness of the outcome doesn't settle the question of whether Hamilton held for the right reasons, or whether he simply couldn't bring himself to authorize withdrawal before it had properly been attempted. 3 days later, on the 28th of April, intelligence reports reaching Hamilton's headquarters identified a gap in the Ottoman line on the Cape Helles front. The intelligence officer's assessment, recorded in staff notes held at the National Archives, describes the gap as approximately 2 miles wide, between the village of Krithia and the sea, and estimates that 2 fresh battalions could reach the heights of Achibaba by nightfall if committed immediately. Hamilton had 3 uncommitted battalions aboard transports offshore. They stayed aboard. By morning, the gap was closed. The village of Krithia, which had been a day 1 objective of the landing plan, would never be taken by Allied forces at any point in the campaign. It would be attacked again and again in 3 separate major engagements, each producing significant casualties and each failing to reach the village. Hamilton's diary entry for the 28th of April makes no mention of the intelligence assessment about the Krithia gap. The intelligence officer's report clearly records that the assessment was communicated to General Headquarters at approximately 2 in the afternoon. Either Hamilton's diary omits a decision he later regretted, which would be, in a published memoir, an entirely understandable editorial choice, or the intelligence reached his staff and was somehow not translated into action before the window closed. The two documents cannot be reconciled. I find it impossible to read the staff note and the diary entry side by side without a specific cold feeling, which is not anger exactly, but is adjacent to it. Hamilton's command and control problem had a structural dimension that deserves proper explanation because it gets obscured by the more dramatic questions of character and judgment. His headquarters was located aboard a ship, initially HMS Queen Elizabeth, then later the converted passenger vessel HMS Arcadian. This meant that all communications between Hamilton and his shore commanders had to pass through the naval wireless network, which operated on different encryption protocols from the Army's field telegraph system. A message from a battalion commander at ANZAC to Hamilton's headquarters involved 4 separate transmission nodes, each requiring manual handling and transcription of map grid references and message text. The signal logs, which survive, document average delays between message origination and receipt at GHQ of between 47 and 180 minutes. Hamilton was never, in any operational sense, in real-time communication with his front lines. By the time he received a report of a tactical situation, the situation had changed. By the time his response arrived, it had changed again. He was commanding at a delay that made decisive intervention structurally near impossible, and nobody before the campaign had seriously reckoned with what that delay would cost. The First Battle of Krithia, on the 28th of April, cost the 29th Division approximately 3,000 casualties in a single day. Krithia wasn't taken. The terrain above the Cape Helles beaches, the steady rise toward the Achi Baba Plateau, was turned over and over again in 3 major engagements through the following months, and the cost each time was roughly proportional to the previous time, and the ground gained each time was roughly 0. Hamilton's diaries across this period describe, with consistent and genuine beauty, the sunsets over the Aegean, the mood of staff officers at dinner, occasional moments of hope. They describe the tactical situations in terms that are always just slightly more optimistic than the staff reports simultaneously entering his headquarters. This wasn't deception, it was, and this is the clinical version of what I mean, the literariness of his mind converting operational reality into a narrative with a shape it didn't actually have. Hamilton was removed on the 14th of October, 1915. The telegram from Kitchener was direct. The War Council has decided that a change is necessary. He was given no further command for the remainder of the war or afterward. His response telegram, sent within the hour, which is itself a kind of telling, reads, according to the Hamilton papers at King's College London, "I know I have done everything that could be done. I leave Gallipoli with a heart full of gratitude and love for my men." There is something in that telegram, in the specific combination of dignity and self-certainty, even at the moment of removal, that tells you more about Hamilton than almost anything else in the record. He believed it. That is, perhaps, the saddest thing about him. His replacement, General Sir Charles Monro, arrived at Gallipoli on the 28th of October, spent exactly 1 day inspecting the positions, and on the following day cabled London recommending immediate evacuation. 1 day. Hamilton had commanded for 6 months and had been unable, or unwilling, to reach the same conclusion. Monro reached it in 24 hours of looking at the same beaches, the same ridge lines, the same casualty returns, the same ammunition reports. What this tells you is either that Monro was a better general, or that Hamilton was too personally invested in the campaign to see it, or that the institutional pressure to succeed had been so enormous that it had made clear assessment impossible from inside the command. Possibly all three. Probably all three. The peninsula was what it had always been. The terrain hadn't changed. It was the relationship between the observer and the evidence that was different. Chapter 7. The Smell of Suvla Bay. On the 6th of August 1915, approximately 25,000 British soldiers came ashore at Suvla Bay on the northern section of the Gallipoli Peninsula. They landed with almost complete tactical surprise. The beach was secured. The Turkish defenders in the immediate area were scattered, outnumbered, and, by the documented accounts of Ottoman staff officers who later described those first hours, genuinely alarmed. In front of the 9th Corps, the rolling Anafata Hills sat largely undefended. Not lightly defended. Not defended with reduced strength. Defended, in the first critical window of the landing, by something in the range of 1,500 Ottoman troops without artillery support, spread across a line of hills that commanded the entire northern sector of the peninsula. The campaign's last genuine strategic opportunity was sitting there in the morning light. 25,000 men, 1,500 defenders, 3 miles of open ground. Nobody moved. That is the Suvla Bay story, stripped to its bones, and what makes it genuinely difficult to process, even now, looking at it from a distance of more than a century, is that it wasn't cowardice. The men weren't cowards. The 9th Corps had landed cleanly, was mostly intact, and by every account was ready to advance. What stopped them was not the enemy. It was the command structure above them, and specifically the figure of Lieutenant General Sir Frederick Stopford, who spent the critical 36 hours of the landing's opportunity window on a ship offshore, reportedly suffering from a leg ailment, sending signals ashore that were measured and encouraging, and entirely devoid of the word advance. His signal of noon on the 7th of August, according to historical accounts of the engagement, expressed satisfaction with the landing's progress. He was reportedly very pleased. The Anafata Hills were 3 miles away. He did not go ashore that day. Hamilton, the overall commander, did not visit Suvla in person until the 8th of August, 48 hours after the landing. What he found when he arrived, in his own diary's account, was Stopford on his ship in a state of relative comfort, satisfied with consolidation. Hamilton's diary uses the word reclining. What followed, according to every account of the meeting, was Hamilton suggesting the advance should be resumed. Suggesting, not ordering, which is a distinction that says everything necessary about the command relationship and the personality dynamics at work in that conversation. By the time Hamilton had returned to his headquarters ship and issued more explicit instructions, and those instructions had moved through the relay network with its documented 47 to 180-minute delays, the morning of the 9th of August had arrived. Lehman von Sanders had been informed of the Suvla landing at approximately 4 in the morning on the 7th. He had immediately ordered a forced march of 2 Ottoman divisions from the southern sector. By the morning of the 8th, the first reinforcements were beginning to arrive at the Anafata Hills. By the evening of the 9th, the window was closed. The hills that 1,500 men had held on the 7th were now covered by a force several times that size, dug in, with artillery brought forward. The ground that could have been taken with a morning's work on the 6th and 7th of August would now require the kind of bloody set-piece assault that had already failed, repeatedly, at Cape Helles. The August offensive's last card had been held in hand until the opponent had time to cover his vulnerability, and then it was played anyway, and failed, as everything at Gallipoli failed when played too late. The total cost of the entire August offensive, Lone Pine, the Neck, Chunuk Bair, and Suvla, was approximately 40,000 Allied casualties. The ground gained across all those operations, negligible. The Suvla sector, which had cost thousands of men and which had been provided with 25,000 fresh troops and the element of surprise, advanced roughly 1,000 meters and then stopped permanently. The hills that overlooked everything were never taken. For the rest of the campaign, the Allied forces at Suvla sat on that coastal plain under the Anafata Heights, in exactly the same relationship to the high ground above them that the ANZACs had maintained since the 25th of April, below the ridgeline, looking up. Stopford's appointment to 9th Corps Command deserves its own examination, because it wasn't random. Hamilton had actually requested a different commander for the Suvla operation, Major General Rawlinson, who had recent operational experience. He was refused by the War Office on the basis of seniority protocol. Stopford was senior to Rawlinson on the Army list. The British Army in 1915 was still operating in certain critical respects on a seniority system that valued time in grade over demonstrated operational competence. Stopford's last active field command before Suvla had been nearly a decade earlier. He had spent the years before the war in administrative roles. Hamilton knew this. He said so in writing when he requested Rawlinson. His request was denied. And so Stopford went to Suvla, and the 9th Corps landed cleanly, and nobody moved toward the hills. The Court of Inquiry convened after the Suvla failure found that Stopford had misunderstood his orders, a verdict of such diplomatic blandness that it tells you more about the British Army's institutional instinct for self-protection than about what actually happened. Stopford wrote his own privately printed account after the war, arguing he had never been clearly ordered to advance and that Hamilton had approved of consolidation. Hamilton's official dispatch implies Stopford acted independently and poorly. Both men failed, Stopford by inertia, Hamilton by suggestion, when the moment required something considerably louder. And the inquiry distributed the culpabilities so thinly across both of them that neither was properly accountable. The only people who were fully accountable were the ones who carried rifles and who waited on the beach for orders that arrived too late or didn't arrive at all. The peculiar psychological weight of Suvla Bay in the campaign's history is that it is not a story of men being asked to do the impossible. It is a story of men not being asked to do the possible. Every other failure at Gallipoli can be attributed to some combination of inadequate resources, hostile terrain, and determined defense. Suvla fails on none of those counts. The resources were there. The terrain was the most benign on the peninsula. The defense was, for approximately 36 hours, genuinely thin. What was absent was a commander willing to use the moment, and what the absence of that willingness produced, 25,000 men sitting on a beach while the hills in front of them slowly filled with reinforcements, is one of the cleanest examples of command failure in the war's full record. Chapter 8. The Correspondence Notebook. Charles Bean arrived at ANZAC Cove on the morning of the 25th of April, 1915, approximately 3 hours after the first landing. He was 35 years old. He carried a Graflex press camera, a set of glass plate negatives, and a notebook. He was the official Australian war correspondent, which meant that unlike the other journalists attached to the MEF, several of whom were already composing dispatches from the relative safety of offshore ships, Bean had decided he needed to be on the beach. He landed, he later wrote, while the outcome was still entirely unclear. He began writing immediately, in a hand that his edited notebooks show was steady despite everything around him, which is either a journalist's professional training or a particular quality of temperament that the record doesn't fully explain. Bean's field notebooks at the Australian War Memorial, a collection running to dozens of individual volumes, densely filled in pencil and ink across more than a year at Gallipoli, are among the most important documents in Australian history, and not entirely for the reasons usually given. They are important for what they contain. They are at least equally important for what they show being removed. The notebooks carry evidence of Bean's editorial hand at work in the field, passages crossed out in pencil, marginal notes revising an earlier description, the occasional insertion in different ink indicating a later return to a recorded moment. This is not surprising in itself. Any serious journalist revises. What is interesting is the pattern of the revisions. The passages that got crossed out tended not to be errors of fact. They tended to be moments of complexity that didn't fit the emerging shape of the story Bean was telling. Accounts of confusion, moments of disorder, the kind of human material that a war produces in enormous quantities, and that official accounts, almost by institutional reflex, compress or remove. Bean's The ANZAC book, published in 1916, while the campaign was still recent, a collection of soldiers' writing, sketches, and poems drawn from the men at Gallipoli, was edited with the same sensibility. He rejected, according to research into his editorial correspondence, pieces that included grotesque content, material that described disabling fear, accounts of soldiers deserting or breaking. He kept the pieces that showed resourcefulness, dark humour, courage, and the particular stoic quality that he was assembling, through months of selection, into what he understood as the Australian character under pressure. This is not a conspiracy. Bean wasn't manufacturing a lie. He was making editorial choices of the kind that every editor makes in every era for every publication. What makes his choices consequential, what makes them historical rather than merely journalistic, is that they were made not for a magazine with a print run of a few thousand, but for a 12-volume official history that would become the primary source for everything that came after. Bean's Official History of Australia in the War of 1914-18, the Gallipoli volumes in particular, is the foundation on which virtually every subsequent account of Australian participation in the campaign was built. When Bean chose to not include the 49 documented court-martial cases for desertion at Gallipoli, he wasn't falsifying the record. Those records exist in the National Archives. He was determining what the first draft of the national story would say, which turned out to be not quite the same thing. The Turkish dead are a thread in Bean's notebooks worth following carefully, because the gap between the notebook and the published text is visible and instructive. In unpublished notebook passages from June 1915, Bean writes with evident feeling about Ottoman soldiers killed in trench clearances, noting they carried photographs, that they were young, that they looked like the men on his own side. He describes them in terms that grant them interior lives. In the official history, Turkish soldiers are described primarily in terms of their military qualities, their stubbornness, their courage, their effectiveness in defense. These are genuine qualities, accurately recorded. But the photographs in the pockets are gone. The interiority has been replaced with professional respect. It is a subtle shift. It is the difference between a war that happens between human beings and a war that happens between forces. The notebooks carry the human beings. The published history carries the forces. I've read the official history and the surviving notebooks enough times to feel the weight of Bean's particular position. That of a man who was simultaneously a journalist, a witness, a national mythologist, and eventually the founding advocate for the institution that would house and amplify everything he'd created. He was the primary force behind the establishment of the Australian War Memorial, proposing it explicitly in 1919 as a place of record. A place of record, not a place of glory, not a place of valorization. His 1919 document uses that specific language, and it is worth noting precisely because the institution that resulted, especially as it has evolved across its decades and particularly through its recent major expansion, has found the boundary between record and glory increasingly difficult to maintain, which is, perhaps, less a failure of Bean's intention than an illustration of what happens when a myth is functional enough that a nation decides it wants to keep it warm. Bean arrived at Gallipoli as a journalist and left as the architect of something considerably larger. The gap between those two roles is visible in the erasures in his notebooks, in the editorial decisions in the ANZAC book, in the patterns of inclusion and omission in the official history. None of this makes the history wrong. Bean was meticulous with facts. The events he recorded happened, The men he described did the things he said they did. But facts can be selected, weighted, and arranged in ways that produce different shapes. And the shape Bean chose, resourcefulness, stoicism, egalitarianism, contempt for class, exceptional performance in small unit action, was a real shape. It existed in the material. It was also a chosen shape, and the nation that grew from it grew, in part, from that choice. The 49 court-martial records sit in the National Archives. The 3,649 glass plate negatives are at the Australian War Memorial, of which 247 were never cleared for publication. Their catalogue entries noting things like shows condition of wounded and shows demoralisation. Bean pressed the shutter, loaded the plate, and brought those images home. He made sure they were preserved. He just didn't publish them. There is something in that combination, preserved but not published, that tells you more about Bean than any single statement he ever wrote about his own intentions. He understood what the archive was for. He also understood what the story was for. He held both things carefully, with considerable intelligence, for his entire working life. And the argument about whether he got the balance right has been running ever since. Chapter 9. The Minefield That Won the War. In the pre-dawn hours of the 7th of March, 1915, a small Ottoman mine-laying vessel moved quietly into Erenkui Bay on the Asian shore of the Dardanelles Strait. The ship was called the Nusret. She displaced approximately 360 tons, roughly the size of a large coastal freighter, and her crew were laying mines in a position that the Allied minesweeping operation had, over the preceding weeks, effectively declared clear. The previous mine lines had been swept. The British and French sweepers had done their work. The area was recorded as safe for the approaching fleet. The Nusret's crew laid 26 mines in a lateral row, perpendicular to the channel current, at a depth of 5 feet across the mouth of the bay. The entire operation took approximately 4 hours. Then the Nusret withdrew, and the bay was quiet again, and the mines sat in the water that everyone had just finished sweeping, and waited. The mechanism of the mines themselves deserves a moment's attention, because it explains precisely why they were so effective against the specific ships that struck them. The type used, German-manufactured, supplied through the military mission operating in Constantinople, employed what was called a Hertz horn detonator. Each mine had a set of lead horns projecting from its body. Inside each horn was a glass vial containing sulfuric acid. The horn was designed to deform on contact with a ship's hull, which shattered the vial, which released the acid, which activated a wet cell battery, which completed an electrical circuit to the main charge. The 5-foot mooring depth was not chosen arbitrarily. It was calculated to bring the mine into contact with the widest beam of a pre-dreadnought battleship, below the waterline strake, where the hull plating was thickest on the sides, but least protected at the bilge curve. Someone with a detailed knowledge of British pre-dreadnought construction specifications had calculated that depth. The German naval mission in Constantinople had those specifications. The 18th of March 1915 was the day the Allied fleet went in for the decisive assault on the Dardanelles. 18 capital ships entered the strait in sequence. The outer forts were partly suppressed. Some of the shore batteries were silenced. The fleet moved forward. At approximately 2 in the afternoon, the French pre-dreadnought Bouvet, maneuvering in Erenkui Bay, struck a mine from the Nusret line. She sank in approximately 2 minutes with the loss of 639 men. In the 90 minutes that followed, HMS Irresistible struck a mine. HMS Ocean, sent to assist Irresistible, struck a second mine and suffered a similar fate. And HMS Inflexible was seriously damaged by a mine strike. 3 capital ships gone or destroyed, a 4th heavily damaged, all from 26 mines that cost less than £2,000 to manufacture, and that were moored in water the Allied sweepers had certified as clear 11 days earlier. The minesweeping operation's fundamental failure was not simply that it had missed the Nusret line. It was that the sweeping doctrine in use made it nearly inevitable that a sufficiently well-planned lateral minefield would be missed. Allied sweepers worked in parallel lines, running with the prevailing current, clearing mines oriented in roughly the same direction as the channel flow. This was the established doctrine. The Nusret's crew, or whoever designed the operation, and German advisory involvement in Ottoman naval strategy at this period is well established, laid their mines precisely across the path that the sweepers had finished clearing, in a transverse orientation that the sweeping pattern was not designed to detect. It was not luck. It was a deliberate tactical adaptation based on knowledge of what the enemy's doctrine was and what it couldn't find. Asymmetric warfare done with a crew on a 360-ton ship against the largest naval fleet assembled in those waters in the war's history. Vice Admiral de Robeck withdrew the fleet at approximately 6 in the evening. His signal to the Admiralty described the operation as suspended pending minesweeping. Not failed, not abandoned, suspended. But in the signals that followed over the next week, as he and Hamilton corresponded about what happened next, the actual decision gradually became clear. He was not going back in. Churchill, in London, argued fiercely for a renewed assault. He wrote, in The World Crisis published in 1923, that the Turkish shore ammunition supply was nearly exhausted on the 18th of March, and that a renewed attack the following day would have succeeded. The Admiralty staff analysis of 1919 disputed this, finding the minefields too dense for the available sweeping capability to clear under fire. What Turkish archival research has subsequently suggested is that the shore ammunition situation was indeed under pressure on the 18th, but that additional mines had been ordered forward and would have been in the water within roughly 2 days. The window, if it existed, was measured in hours. De Robeck didn't know that, but he also wasn't inclined to go back in, and in the absence of categorical reassurance that the minefields could be cleared, suspended pending minesweeping became, in practical effect, permanent. What happened after the fleet withdrew was, in institutional terms, a decision that was not quite made. Nobody formally decided that the naval operation was over and that a land campaign would follow. What happened instead was that the failure of the naval assault created a kind of gravitational pull toward a land operation, because the alternative was to acknowledge, publicly and completely, that the entire Dardanelles strategy had failed. And nobody was willing to do that. Churchill wasn't willing to. The War Council, collectively, wasn't willing to. The institutional momentum of an operation already in motion, already publicly committed to, already with a commander in the field and a fleet offshore, all of that created pressure toward continuation, even though the plan on which continuation depended, the plan that had never included a serious land force contingency, had been stopped by 26 mines at 5 feet depth in a bay that the sweepers had already cleared. The Nusret survived the war. She continued in Turkish naval service until 1955. She came close to being scrapped. A public campaign saved her. She is now a museum ship in the Turkish city of Çanakkale, moored approximately 3 kilometers from where she laid her mines on the night of the 7th of March, 1915. She is the only significant surviving naval vessel from the entire Gallipoli Campaign. 11,000 tons of Allied battleships went to the bottom in 90 minutes on the 18th of March. The ship that put them there is sitting in a harbour, preserved and visited less than a morning's drive from the peninsula. History occasionally has a sense of proportion so exact it almost seems editorial. Chapter 10. What the Nurses Knew. Open the admission register for the 1st Australian General Hospital at Lemnos for the week of the 12th to the 18th of June, 1915, and run your eye down the diagnosis column. Of 847 admissions recorded in that 7-day period, More than 600 are not gunshot wounds, not shell fragment wounds. They are enteric fever, dysentery, paratyphoid, septicemia from wound infection, exhaustion, which in military medical records of this period is a diagnosis that covers several things, few of them trivial. More than 70% of the men entering the hospital in that single week had not been directly injured by any Turkish weapon. They had been injured by contaminated water, by flies, by bacteria thriving in the specific conditions of a besieged peninsula in a Mediterranean summer. The enemy was winning a battle the Turks couldn't win alone, and it was winning it through the digestive systems of the men holding the line. Lemnos is an island approximately 50 miles from the Gallipoli Peninsula, and it was designated as the primary base hospital location for the MEF at the campaign's outset. When the first casualties arrived on the 25th of April, 1915, the hospitals had no running water, no electricity, no drainage, and insufficient tent capacity. The Principal Director of Medical Services report, which assessed the situation in the first weeks, describes the conditions with a restraint that is itself a historical document. Preparations were found to be some weeks from completion, is the phrase. What that phrase covers, in human terms, is wounded men being triaged in open air on dirt ground, with medical staff performing procedures by lantern light, on an island that had been selected for logistical reasons, without adequate advance assessment of its physical infrastructure. The selection decision was made in committee in London. The nurses found out what the island was actually like when they arrived. The nursing sisters at Lemnos were not supposed to be there in the first place. The original MEF medical plan placed all nursing personnel on hospital ships, not on shore. What brought the sisters to the island was the same force that disrupted everything else in the campaign's planning: the actual scale of casualties, which arrived in numbers that the plan hadn't accommodated and for which the ship's capacity was wholly insufficient. Sisters were sent to the shore hospitals as a practical emergency response. The formal orders authorizing their presence on the island arrived approximately 6 weeks after they had begun working there. For 6 weeks, the women running the wards were doing so in an administrative void, present, functioning, professionally responsible for the outcomes in front of them, and technically unauthorized by any piece of paper in the system. The fly problem at Gallipoli is documented in the official disease reports, in the nursing diaries, in virtually every personal letter from the peninsula in the summer months. The official AWM report on disease at ANZAC, drawing directly from regimental medical officers' records, identifies flies as the principal transmission vector for the enteric epidemic. The fly density in the trenches by June was sufficient, according to multiple documented accounts, to blacken exposed food within minutes. This isn't rhetorical. The regimental medical officers measured it because they needed to understand the disease pathway. The flies were breeding in the unburied dead and in the inadequate latrine arrangements of a position that had been built for an offensive operation and never redesigned for a siege. Every soldier who ate carried flies into his food. Every case of dysentery produced the conditions for more dysentery. Over 80% of Allied troops at Gallipoli were infected with dysentery by the summer. Over 80%. Including General Hamilton himself, according to research by military medical historian Stephen Badsey, who notes Hamilton took 10 years to fully recover. The typhoid vaccination situation deserves to be stated plainly, because it is the kind of detail that converts a disease epidemic from a tragic inevitability into something more uncomfortable. Typhoid vaccination, the TAB vaccine, was available in 1915 and was in use by the British Army. The MEF's vaccination rate at the campaign's start was approximately 67% of personnel. The threshold required for meaningful population-level protection against a typhoid epidemic in the conditions the MEF was operating in was substantially higher. Military epidemiologists of the period were working with estimates in the range of 90%. The gap between 67 and 90% of a force of nearly 500,000 men represents, in direct human terms, The mechanism by which thousands of men died of a preventable disease during a campaign where every casualty degraded an already overstrained fighting strength. The vaccination shortfall wasn't a battlefield decision. It was an administrative one, made before anyone left Egypt. The specific authority problem that nursing sisters faced at Gallipoli is worth pausing on, because it exposes a structural inequity with consequences that went beyond frustration. Nursing sisters in the Australian Army Nursing Service held a rank equivalent to warrant officer, not commissioned rank. In the British and Australian military supply system, formal requisition requests for equipment, for medical supplies, for additional dressings had to originate from a commissioned officer. A sister who identified that her ward was running out of wound dressings could not herself submit a formal supply request. She had to find a commissioned medical officer to submit it on her behalf, and that officer had to be available, and the officer's assessment of the urgency had to match hers, and the supply chain had to respond in time. In a hospital operating at 3 times its planned capacity, in conditions nobody had properly prepared for, this bureaucratic constraint had direct patient consequences. The nursing diary accounts from Lemnos contain recurring mentions of supply shortages that the writers clearly understood they could see, but could not, by the system's own rules, directly remedy. I find myself staying with the nurses' diaries longer than almost any other source category in the Gallipoli record, because they are documents of a particular kind of professional grief. The grief of people who understand precisely what is wrong and precisely what would fix it, and who are, systematically and structurally, not in a position to make it right. The sister whose ward ran out of dressings and watched 3 men develop septicemia didn't misdiagnose the problem. She named it in her diary with clinical precision. The system that prevented her from fixing it wasn't malicious. It was simply the application of a bureaucratic framework to a situation for which it wasn't designed, by people who had designed it for a different war that didn't involve this specific peninsula in this specific summer with this specific shortage of everything. But the men died of septicemia anyway, and the diary entry sits in the archive, precise and unavoidable. It says what it says. The mortality rate differential between men who received formal hospital admission within 6 hours of wounding and men who waited more than 24 hours was documented in the ADMS records at approximately 23% higher for the delayed group. 23%. The beach at Cape Helles in the first days of the campaign had men lying on it for up to 42 hours before evacuation. The arithmetic connects directly. The delay between landing and hospital admission killed a computable number of people, and that number was computable in May of 1915, and the system that produced the delay was not fundamentally changed. The hospitals at Lemnos recorded the consequences. The campaign's operational planning, running on a different administrative track, absorbed the numbers as casualties and continued. Chapter 11. Shell, Fuse, Charge. The Ammunition Arithmetic. There is a specific entry that appears in British and Australian regimental war diaries from Gallipoli with enough regularity that, by the time you've read 20 or 30 unit diaries from the May to September 1915 period, encountering it again produces a particular kind of recognition. The wording varies slightly unit by unit, but the meaning is identical each time. Attack cancelled. Artillery support refused. Insufficient ammunition. Or, advance postponed. No artillery available. Or, in the bluntest version I found, ordered forward without guns. Went. 23 separate documented instances across 12 unit diary sets in that period. Not a crisis, a condition. The shells weren't there, and the men went forward without them, and then the diaries recorded what happened next. The allocation formula that produced this condition deserves explanation, because it wasn't the result of carelessness or incompetence in the ordinary sense. The British Army's method for calculating monthly ammunition allocations to a formation was based on frontage, the length of the front line held by that formation, measured in miles. The formula had been developed from Western Front experience, where the terrain was largely flat, where guns could range on visible targets, where the direct relationship between frontage and ammunition consumption was reasonably reliable. Gallipoli's terrain was none of those things. The ravines, the reverse slopes, the ridgelines, all of them meant that to achieve the same suppressive effect on a defending position that required 20 shells on the Western Front, the MEF might need 60 or 80 shells, because most of the shells fired would hit the forward face of a ridge or land beyond a crest without touching anything significant. The formula didn't account for terrain multipliers. Nobody appears to have formally proposed adjusting the formula for the specific conditions of the peninsula. The allocation shipped. It ran out. The diaries wrote it down. By the 30th of April, 5 days after landing, the MEF at Cape Helles had expended 57% of its entire first-month 18-pounder allocation. The resupply chain from Alexandria required a minimum of 14 days. In practical terms, this meant the June offensive operations, the repeated attempts to take the village of Krithia and the Achi Baba Heights, were being conducted with guns limited to a maximum of 4 rounds per gun per day at various points. 4 rounds. Platoon commanders received explicit instructions not to request artillery support for attacks involving fewer than 3 companies. This is worth sitting with for a moment. The threshold for requesting the support of your own artillery was set so high by ammunition rationing that small unit actions, the tactical building block of any assault, simply proceeded without it. The British shell crisis of 1915. The scandal that erupted after newspaper coverage described ammunition shortages on the Western Front is well documented and was a genuine political crisis that brought down Asquith's government and produced the Ministry of Munitions under Lloyd George. What is less often emphasized is that Gallipoli sat at the bottom of the allocation priority list throughout this crisis. A request from the MEF, submitted in June of 1915, for a doubled monthly allocation was declined by the Master General of Ordnance, with a notation that France must have priority. This was a reasonable position in one sense. The Western Front held more men, faced a more immediate strategic threat, and had greater political weight in the system. In another sense, it meant that the Gallipoli Campaign was being fought on the arithmetic assumption that it needed half the shells per mile of front that France needed, on terrain that required 3 to 4 times as many shells to achieve the same effect. The howitzer gap is in some ways the clearest single expression of the entire ammunition problem. The terrain of the Gallipoli Peninsula required plunging trajectory fire, shells arriving from above, fired at steep angles, to reach defenders dug into reverse slopes. The weapon that fires at those angles is the howitzer. The MEF went to Gallipoli with 8 heavy howitzers for an 8-mile front. 8. The German army on the Western Front at the comparable period was deploying in the order of 1 howitzer per few hundred meters of contested front. 8 howitzers for 8 miles of peninsula meant each gun was responsible for roughly a mile of reverse slope that flat trajectory 18-pounders physically could not reach. The MEF's formal request for additional howitzers was submitted in May of 1915 and partially answered in September, 4 months later. The interim was covered by courage, which is not a supply chain solution. The technical ballistic problem at the heart of this chapter can be stated precisely. An 18-pounder field gun fires its shell at an elevation of approximately 15 degrees, roughly flat, a low arc. A ridge of 30 meters in height, standing 500 meters from the firing position, creates a dead zone behind the crest of approximately 150 meters in depth, where no 18-pounder shell will penetrate. Not won't penetrate with sufficient explosive effect, simply won't physically reach, because the trajectory takes it over the ridge crest and it lands beyond the defended position. The Ottoman defensive planners, who had months to study the topography before the Allied landings, had systematically placed their main trench lines on the reverse slopes of every significant ridge on the peninsula, inside that dead zone. This wasn't brilliance, it was the application of elementary ballistic geometry to the available terrain. The British and Australian assault battalions spent months attacking uphill toward trench systems that their own artillery literally could not touch, with guns that were running out of shells. What I find most difficult about the ammunition record isn't the shortage itself, which was real and serious, but which at least had an explicable cause in production capacity and allocation priority. What I find difficult is the evidence that the shortage was visible in real time, in the weekly expenditure returns, in the unit diary entries, in the formal requests that went to the Master General of Ordnance, and that none of it, not a single documented decision in the records I've examined, produced a fundamental adjustment to either the campaign's pace or its tactical approach. The men kept being sent forward. The guns kept being rationed. The diaries kept recording "attack cancelled" and "advance without artillery." And the weekly returns kept showing a deficit that never closed, that was in fact structural rather than temporary, that was the predictable output of a formula applied to the wrong terrain. It wasn't a surprise, it was arithmetic. And arithmetic doesn't stop being true because nobody wants to look at the numbers. Chapter 12. The New Zealanders at Chinook Bay. There is a single entry in a soldier's personal diary, written sometime before dawn on the 8th of August 1915, at the summit of a ridge on the Gallipoli Peninsula called Chinook Bay. The soldier was Lieutenant Colonel William Malone, commanding the Wellington Infantry Battalion of the New Zealand Expeditionary Force. He had just done something that no Allied commander had managed in more than 3 months of fighting. He had reached the highest significant point of ground on the peninsula. From where he stood, he could see the Dardanelles Strait on one side and the Aegean on the other. He could see the Narrows, the strategic objective the entire campaign had been designed to reach. He wrote in his diary, in language that the available accounts have preserved, if not verbatim, then in substance. "We are on the top. I can see the Narrows. If they can reinforce us before dawn, the peninsula is ours." No reinforcements arrived before dawn. Malone was dead before the morning was out. The summit would be lost within 2 days. But for those hours between darkness and first light on the 8th of August 1915, the thing the Allied forces had been trying to achieve since the 19th of February was for the only time in the campaign's history within the range of possibility. Getting the Wellington Battalion to the summit required a night march up the rhododendron spur in complete darkness, guided by a compass bearing and a sketch map, following a route guide provided by Corps headquarters, who had not personally walked the ground. The guide lost the track approximately halfway up. The column was reassembled by Malone through a whispered count of ranks in the darkness, a process that the battalion's own war diary records as producing a delay of several hours. They reached their assault position late. They attacked up the final slope at approximately 3 in the morning and reached the summit at around 5, finding a small Turkish garrison that was overwhelmed in the assault. The total Wellington Battalion casualties in the night approach and the summit seizure were approximately 250 men. When they looked out from the top in the early light, the peninsula was spread below them in both directions, and the strait was visible, and the Narrows were there. And then their own artillery began registering their position. This is the part of the Chinook Bay story that tends to get absorbed into the general account without being given the specific weight it deserves. The Allied artillery support for the August offensive had been registered on coordinates agreed before the attack. Those coordinates reflected where the Wellington Battalion was expected to be at given times during the assault. The battalion reached the summit faster than the plan had anticipated. A success, in other words, that the artillery timeline wasn't designed to accommodate. When the naval and Allied battery fire opened in support of the advance at around 8 in the morning, several shells fell short of the intended registration point. They fell onto the summit. The men who had climbed through the night and taken the ridge were taking casualties from their own guns. Malone signalled Corps headquarters to adjust the fire. The adjustment, working through the relay system with its documented delays, took approximately 90 minutes to complete. Malone was killed before it was done. The Wellington Battalion's war diary records approximately 30 casualties from the short rounds that morning. The artillery log for the supporting battery does not record any short rounds in that sector on that date. The two documents disagree. The men on the summit knew what they experienced. By the afternoon of the 9th of August, the Wellington Battalion had been at the summit for over 30 hours. Effective strength from the approximately 700 men who had assaulted was somewhere around 70 fighting soldiers. Casualties had been running at a rate that no unit could sustain indefinitely. The combination of the assault losses, the short rounds in the morning, and the Turkish counterfire that had been intensifying since dawn had reduced the battalion to a remnant, holding a position it had taken at maximum effort. They were relieved by two British battalions, who took over the summit position that evening. At dawn on the 10th of August, Mustafa Kemal personally led a massed Ottoman counterattack against Chunuk Bair. The British battalions holding the summit, fresh but unfamiliar with the position and the specific topography of the ridge, were overwhelmed. By mid-morning, the summit was back in Ottoman hands. The entire gain of the night march, the assault, the 36 hours of brutal holding, everything the Wellington Battalion had done and paid for, was erased in approximately 3 hours. The Chunuk Bair Memorial, built on the ridge's summit in 1925, commemorates over 850 New Zealanders with no known grave. It faces south, toward ANZAC Cove and the sea. It stands on the ground that Malone reached before dawn on the 8th of August, and that was lost before noon on the 10th. Over the entire Chunuk Bair operation, the New Zealand forces suffered 880 killed and close to 2,500 wounded, from a total New Zealand force at Gallipoli of approximately 8,500 men. That is a casualty rate from a single operation of roughly 40% of the entire New Zealand expeditionary contingent. To describe this as disproportionate barely covers it. The Wellington Infantry Battalion went in at a nominal strength of 760 and came out with 70. The nominal math, which says nothing about the specific names behind the numbers, says that for every 10 men who climbed the rhododendron spur on the night of the 6th of August, approximately 9 were dead or wounded by the morning of the 9th. The friendly fire question at Chunuk Bair is unresolved in the documentary record, and is likely to remain so. The discrepancy between the battalion diary and the battery log is precisely the kind of source conflict that gets smoothed over in official histories, because neither document is definitively wrong in the way that can be proven, and because both documents were produced by people who were not in each other's positions. What the discrepancy represents, at a structural level, is the communication breakdown between rapidly advancing infantry and the supporting artillery that was calibrated for their expected rather than their actual position. It is the same problem that killed men at every stage of every major assault on the peninsula. It killed men at Chunuk Bair at the moment of the campaign's only genuine success. In the 90 minutes between Malone's signal requesting the adjustment and the adjustment's completion, the gap between communication technology and the speed of events on the ground was made visible in the most direct possible way. Malone's diary ends before the correction arrived. Chapter 13. The Politics of Staying. On the 23rd of September 1915, a 25-page letter arrived at the office of the Australian Prime Minister, Andrew Fisher. It had been written by a young journalist named Keith Murdoch, later known as Sir Keith, and father of the more famous Rupert, who had recently visited Gallipoli as a press correspondent and who had returned from the peninsula in a state of controlled fury at what he had seen and heard. The letter described the campaign in terms of comprehensive failure. The leadership, the conditions, the casualties, the sense among the men that they had been committed to an operation that their commanders did not know how to prosecute. It was written to Fisher personally, and it reached a prime minister who was dealing with a specific and intensely uncomfortable problem. He had not, as of that date, received any official accounting from the British government of the Australian casualties his country had sustained since the 25th of April. Fisher had been Prime Minister for 3 weeks when the letter arrived. He had assumed office in September, after the Labour Party's internal succession, and had inherited, among other things, a war that Australia was fighting without any formal voice in how it was conducted. The command structure of the Australian Imperial Force ran from General Birdwood, through Hamilton, through Kitchener, through the War Council in London, with no Australian government representative at any point in the chain. Australian men were dying in numbers that the press was beginning to report, and the mechanism for informing the Australian government officially, through the Colonial Office in London, was generating the kind of response that produces, in any fair reading, a particular kind of controlled diplomatic outrage. Available accounts of this period describe Fisher pressing for basic casualty figures and receiving assurances that information would follow, without the figures themselves arriving with any speed or specificity. The colonial relationship, which in peacetime was largely ceremonial, was in wartime exposed in its actual character. Canberra funded and equipped and provided the men. London decided how they were used. The constitutional mechanism by which this was possible is worth examining, because it was not informal or accidental. The Defence Act of 1903, Australia's own legislation, specifically prohibited the compulsory service of Australian military forces outside Australian territory. Volunteer forces, however, could be committed by the Governor-General, acting on advice from the Colonial Office. This is the mechanism that had deployed the AIF to Egypt and then to Gallipoli, a vice-regal administrative decision made in consultation with London without parliamentary debate. No vote in the Australian Parliament authorised the commitment of Australian forces to the Gallipoli Campaign. A Governor-General's signature, on advice from a British colonial office that was itself acting under War Council direction, was the legal basis on which approximately 50,000 Australians were committed to 8 months of fighting on a peninsula in the Aegean Sea. The conscription crisis that would tear the Australian Labour Party apart in 1916, splitting it, destroying Fisher's successor Billy Hughes as a Labour figure, and defining Australian political culture for a generation, has its roots in this 1915 period. By September of that year, volunteer enlistment rates, which had been high in the early months of the war, had begun to decline. The decline was being discussed in caucus. The connection between the casualty rate at Gallipoli and the difficulty of sustaining volunteer enlistment was not a secret analysis. It was a political conversation happening in the open, in party meetings, in newspaper columns. More than 26,000 Australian casualties in a campaign that had produced no strategic result that could be clearly articulated was not a recruiting argument. The men who would later campaign for conscription and the men who would campaign bitterly against it were all responding, in different ways, to the same underlying arithmetic. What Keith Murdoch's letter did, and the historical debate about its precise influence on the evacuation decision, is ongoing, with some historians arguing it was decisive and others arguing it has been retrospectively overcredited, was provide the Australian Prime Minister with a vivid, first-hand account of conditions at Gallipoli at a moment when official communications were providing very little. Fisher passed the letter to the British Prime Minister Asquith. A copy reached the War Council. It became one of the pieces of evidence, alongside Monro's inspection report and Kitchener's visit in November, that fed the growing private consensus that the campaign needed to end. Whether Murdoch's letter was the catalyst for that consensus, or merely one of its more colourful contributions, is a question the archive can't fully settle, because the decision to evacuate was itself made so indirectly, through such a diffuse process of private concession, that identifying a single trigger for it is probably a misunderstanding of how the decision was actually made. The Gallipoli Campaign was conducted as though Australia's participation was the willing contribution of a junior partner in a shared enterprise with a common purpose. That framing, which appears in every official British account of the Dominion relationship during the war, was not entirely false. There was genuine shared purpose. There was genuine willingness, in the sense that the men who enlisted did so voluntarily. But the mechanism of command, the allocation of resources, the setting of objectives, the decision to continue or to end, all of this was conducted in London, in a political system in which Australia had no representative, formal or informal, at the decision-making table. Fisher's request for casualty figures, and the response that information would follow, is one of the cleaner expressions of this structure that the documentary record preserves. The men were Australian, the decisions were British. The graves were in both cases on the same peninsula. The casualty notification system further illustrates the gap between the scale of Australian sacrifice and the administrative structures designed to account for it. The Base Records Office in Melbourne handled next of kin notifications, receiving information by cable from the MEF through the War Office in London. The documented average delay between a man's death at Gallipoli and his family's receipt of official notification during the May to September period was between 14 and 21 days. Letters of condolence from commanding officers, standard practice in the British regimental system, were not systematically provided to Australian families because no mechanism existed in the AIF's administrative structure to generate them at scale. A family in Wagga Wagga or Ballarat waiting for news of a son was waiting for a cable from London, routed through Melbourne, arriving an average of 2 to 3 weeks after the event it reported. In between, they read the newspapers. This is documented. It is not an abstraction. Andrew Fisher resigned as Prime Minister on the 27th of October, 1915, citing the strain of the past year. He was replaced by Billy Hughes, who would go on to advocate for conscription and entrench Australia's imperial commitment for the duration of the war. Fisher's personal letters from September and October of that year, held at the National Library of Australia, describe a man exhausted by a particular kind of helplessness. The helplessness of being responsible, in the eyes of his country, for a campaign he had no mechanism to influence or redirect. His resignation is usually described in terms of health. His letters from those weeks suggest something more specific than health, the specific exhaustion of a man who understood, clearly and completely, that there was nothing he could do to change what was happening to his countrymen, and who had run out of language to pretend otherwise. Chapter 14. A Letter That Wasn't Sent. The enlistment record is clean and brief. Name, Cecil McAnulty. Age, 18. Occupation, farm labourer. Reason for enlistment. The form has a printed space for this, and the word written there, in handwriting that subsequent records confirm as his own, is duty. He was passed fit by the medical examiner. Good teeth, no defects. He weighed 68 kilograms on the day the examiner recorded it. He signed his name at the bottom of the form, with the kind of confident flourish that 18-year-olds produce when they believe they are about to do something significant and aren't yet sure what it will cost. He arrived at ANZAC Cove as a reinforcement in late May of 1915, approximately a month after the initial landing. The men he joined had already been on the peninsula long enough to have developed what every long-term Gallipoli soldier seemed to develop: a particular economy of movement, a specific attunement to which sounds required response and which didn't, a relationship with the terrain so detailed that they could navigate the ravines in complete darkness by a memory of gradients. McAnulty came into this established world as an outsider, which his early diary entries make quietly clear. He looked at the landscape the way a farmer's son looks at unfamiliar land, noting drainage, soil type, the quality of the scrub on the hillsides. He was trying to understand his new environment through the only frame he had, which was agriculture, which was both completely inadequate to what he was looking at and, in its specificity, more honest than most of what the official record preserved. His diary entry for the 19th of May, 1915, is 3 sentences. On that day, the Ottoman forces launched their largest coordinated assault on the ANZAC perimeter, approximately 42,000 troops attacking in the pre-dawn hours across the wire. The assault was repulsed by morning, with heavy Ottoman losses. McAnulty's 3 sentences. There were a lot of them, and then there were fewer of them, and then it was morning. My hands have not stopped shaking yet, but I think they will. The entire battle, by any measure one of the most intense nights of the campaign, is compressed into 2 observations and a prediction about his own physiology. The prediction, incidentally, was correct. His hands steadied. He remained on the peninsula for 4 more months. Somewhere in the middle months of his time at ANZAC, McAnulty wrote a letter to his mother that he never sent. The letter exists in the archive at the Australian War Memorial, folded inside his diary, unaddressed, unsealed, undated. It is not a literary document in any conventional sense. The sentences are sometimes incomplete. The grammar shifts register unpredictably. There are passages that circle back on themselves, starting a thought and then abandoning it and starting again. The way that thoughts actually move when the person thinking them is trying to say something they don't have an adequate vocabulary for. He mentions the wheat at home. He asks whether the lower paddock has been cut yet. Then he writes something that I keep returning to every time I come back to the Gallipoli archive. I am all right. I am not always all right. I do not know how to say the difference. That is not poetry. It is not craft. It is a 19-year-old farm labourer from Wagga Wagga trying to communicate something that the available language simply couldn't carry, and knowing it, and writing the gap itself down. The middle section of the letter describes a man he calls Thomas, without a surname. Thomas had been part of his immediate section. He'd been here and then he wasn't. That's the phrasing McAnulty uses, and it's the same compression as the 19th of May diary entry. The same instinct to describe the periphery of a thing, rather than the thing itself. What McAnulty chose to record about Thomas was not how he died. It was what he did at night. Thomas, the letter says, used to hum to himself going to sleep. Some song I did not know. The night after Thomas was gone, McAnulty lay in the dark and waited to hear it. He didn't hear it. He wrote this down. He did not send the letter. I don't think it's possible to read that passage and convert it into an argument about anything. Some things in an archive resist the historian's reflex to make things stand for something. The letter is not an argument for the futility of war, or a document of national identity, or a record of the ANZAC legend's human substrate. It is a 20-year-old who missed a man's humming in the dark, and didn't know how to say that to his mother without frightening her, and so folded the letter inside his diary instead, and carried it through the rest of the campaign. The not sending of it is itself part of what it says. McAnulty was evacuated in September of 1915 with a shrapnel wound to his left forearm. He was treated at a field hospital, transferred to the base hospital network, and returned to Australia in November. His last diary entry from the peninsula is 5 words. On the ship, going home. The last entry before that, written in the days before evacuation. I do not know what I will tell them. He survived the war. He returned to Wagga Wagga. He grew vegetables in his retirement, a specific variety of pumpkin that family accounts describe as his particular pride. According to an interview his daughter gave to the Australian War Memorial, recorded in the early 2000s. He cried every year on the 25th of April until his death in 1967. He never explained to his children why. The unsent letter was found in his diary when he died. His family donated it to the memorial in 1969. It has been in the archive ever since, folded the same way he folded it, asking about the wheat. The 2nd Battalion, AIF, McNulty's unit, landed at Gallipoli on the 25th of April with 974 men. By the time of the evacuation in December, the battalion had received 411 reinforcements and had an effective strength of approximately 440 men. Total casualties over the campaign, 945. The unit's human composition, in terms of the specific people who made it up, had been almost entirely replaced twice over. The men who boarded the evacuation ships as the 2nd Battalion were, by a clear majority, not the men who had waded ashore in April. The name stayed the same. The men inside the name were almost entirely different. McNulty was one of the few continuous threads between the landing and the departure. Wounded, hospitalized, replaced in the line by a reinforcement, his space in the order of battle filled before he left. The battalion carried on without him. He carried the letter home. Chapter 15. The Decision Nobody Made. The Dardanelles Committee met 11 times in October and November of 1915, without formally voting on the question that had been its sole effective purpose since September. The minutes of those meetings, a document type that Maurice Hankey had been producing with meticulous care since the beginning of the war, show a committee circling a decision with the systematic avoidance of men who understand perfectly well what they need to do and are collectively unwilling to be the ones seen doing it. The question of evacuation was raised but not voted upon. It was agreed to defer the matter pending further reports. 3 days later, the same entry in almost the same words, and again, and again. 11 meetings, no vote. The machinery of how the evacuation decision was eventually reached says something important about how large institutional decisions actually get made, not through the dramatic vote at a critical table, but through a gradual accumulation of private concessions, until the position being publicly defended no longer has any private defenders left, at which point the formal vote becomes a ratification of a conclusion that was actually reached weeks earlier in separate rooms. Lord Curzon, who was among the most vocal opponents of evacuation on the committee, is the figure who illuminates this most clearly, because his papers preserve both the argument he was making publicly and the argument he was making to himself. He submitted a memorandum estimating evacuation would cost between 30 and 40% casualties. He appears to have doubted his own figure, based on what survives in his private correspondence, but he submitted the high estimate anyway. The high estimate served a function. It gave the committee a reason to keep deferring, which is what the committee needed in order to not have to decide. It was a number in service of a pause. General Monro's role in this process is almost too clean to seem real, but it's in the record. He arrived at Gallipoli on the 28th of October, 1915, replacing Hamilton. He spent 1 day, a single day, inspecting the positions. He went ashore at ANZAC Cove, at Suvla, at Cape Helles. He looked at the terrain and the state of the men and the logistical situation with the eyes of someone who had not been living inside the campaign's operational logic for 8 months, who had no personal investment in the decisions that had produced the current situation. On the 29th of October, he cabled London recommending immediate evacuation. 1 day. Hamilton had commanded for 6 months and couldn't reach that conclusion. Monro reached it between breakfast and dinner. The lesson being offered here is not that Monro was a better general. It is that 6 months of institutional proximity to a failing campaign produces a specific kind of blindness that 1 day of fresh observation dissolves instantly. Hamilton wasn't stupid. He was too close to see it. Kitchener visited the peninsula in November, the only member of the War Council to do so at any point during the campaign's 9 months. His private assessment, produced in a report to the War Committee, recommended evacuation. His public position had been that evacuation would cost between 25 and 50% casualties, a figure he had stated in committee with the authority that attached to his name and his moustache, and his decades of military seniority. A figure that had been the single largest factor in the committee's repeated deferrals. His private report suggested the actual casualty cost might be in the range of 5 to 10%. The gap between his public and private estimates is significant enough to require acknowledgement. 25 to 50% in committee, 5 to 10% in the private report. This is not a small discrepancy in the order of rounding errors. This is a figure that, if the private estimate was sincere, had been deployed in public specifically to prevent the evacuation decision from being made. Whether this was conscious strategy or an honest revision of view upon actually seeing the positions, the archive doesn't resolve it definitively. The formal vote to evacuate came on the 8th of December, 1915. The committee that had been circling the question for 3 months voted unanimously in 35 minutes. 35 minutes. After everything, after 9 months of campaign, after more than 140,000 Allied casualties, after all the committees and dispatches and deferrals, the formal decision took less time than a routine meeting of the same body. What that speed tells you is that the decision had already been made in private. The vote was ceremonial. It ratified a consensus that had been building since October, and it took 35 minutes because everyone already knew what they were going to do. And the only remaining question was the procedure. The evacuation planning, once the decision was made, was placed in the hands of the operational staff. And here, the story produces one of its most pointed ironies. The man who designed and supervised the evacuation plan for ANZAC and Suvla was a lieutenant colonel named Charles Dardanelles White, an Australian. The plan he produced was, by the assessment of essentially every military historian who has examined it, a genuine operational achievement. It required the withdrawal of approximately 83,000 men from 3 beachheads over multiple nights, without the enemy becoming aware of what was happening. It needed the Turks to continue believing that the Allied positions were normally manned until the last possible moment. White's plan accomplished this through a combination of gradually reduced activity over 3 weeks, fire rates declining slowly enough not to signal a pattern, and the specific technical improvisation of the self-firing rifles. The device was simple enough to deserve a precise description. A rifle was fixed in a firing position with its trigger connected by a string to a tin suspended above another tin. The upper tin was filled with water. The water dripped slowly into the lower tin. As the lower tin filled with water, its weight increased. When the weight reached the point at which the string tension exceeded the trigger pull resistance, the rifle fired. By varying the amount of water in the upper tin, the triggering time could be set between roughly 15 minutes and several hours. A trench line of self-firing rifles, set at different intervals, continued to produce rifle fire at irregular, but not obviously automated patterns, for hours after the last soldier had walked down to the beach. The Turks heard the fire and maintained their defensive posture. The positions they were watching were empty. The evacuation of ANZAC was completed by the early hours of the 20th of December, 1915. Total Allied casualties from enemy action during the entire evacuation, approximately 3 men. Not 300, not 3,000. 3. The contrast between that figure and the figures that had been stated in public by Kitchener, 25 to 50%, which on a force of 83,000 men would have been between 20,000 and 40,000 casualties, is so large that it is tempting to reach for explanations that involve deliberate deception. But the more straightforward explanation is probably the correct one. Kitchener had never seen the positions, was operating from outdated assessments, and was using a worst-case figure that suited the committee's need to defer without actually having done the engineering work to know what evacuation would cost. White had done the engineering work. His plan worked exactly as he had designed it, and the one genuinely successful military operation of the entire Gallipoli campaign was planned by an Australian, executed by the men who had been living on the peninsula for 8 months, and achieved its result by the low technology of dripping water pulling a trigger in an empty trench. Chapter 16. The Commission and the Convenient Truth. The Dardanelles Commission of 1916 to 1917 heard evidence from 168 witnesses across 89 days of proceedings. This is a substantial body of work by any measure. The report it produced, in interim form in March of 1917 and in final form in 1919, ran to hundreds of pages of documented testimony, cross-examination, and considered findings. It found problems. It named them with some care. Churchill's evidence took 2 days, and he was questioned, by the account of everyone present, with the full force of his considerable intelligence applied to the project of explaining why what happened had not been his fault. Fisher's evidence was complicated by the simple fact that Lord Fisher died before the Commission's work was complete. Kitchener drowned in June of 1916 when HMS Hampshire struck a German mine off the Orkney Islands, which is a fact so precisely ironic, given his role in the campaign that was largely halted by mines, that responsible historians typically record it without comment. 2 of the 3 men most centrally responsible for the Dardanelles decision were beyond the Commission's reach when it needed them most. The Commission's terms of reference are the document that tells you the most about what the inquiry was actually designed to do. They specified an investigation into the conduct of the Dardanelles operations, including the naval attack on the Dardanelles Straits. The phrase, including the naval attack, is doing structural work that is easy to miss on a first reading. It extends the Commission's mandate to the naval phase, which is inclusive and appropriate. But its construction also, implicitly, defines the scope as the operational conduct of the campaign, rather than its strategic conception, its logistical preparation, its medical provision, or its ammunition allocation. The loading manifests that placed machine guns below blankets on the transport ships were not within scope. The formula that calculated the MEF's shell allocation by a Western Front frontage metric were not within scope. The vaccination rates that produced the summer enteric epidemic were not within scope. The Commission investigated decisions. It did not investigate the system within which decisions were made, and a system that cannot examine its own underlying architecture can produce findings that are accurate at the surface and entirely inadequate at the depth. Churchill was returned to government in July of 1917 as Minister of Munitions under Lloyd George. The same month the Commission's interim report was published. The timing is not coincidental in any conspiratorial sense. It is simply that Lloyd George needed Churchill's specific organisational abilities for the munitions problem, and the Commission's relatively measured verdict on the Dardanelles made the appointment politically defensible. Churchill would spend the rest of his life arguing, with increasing literary force and diminishing dispassion, that Gallipoli had been a strategically sound idea that failed due to inadequate execution and timid command. His version of events, published in The World Crisis in 1923, is beautifully written, massively detailed, and precisely positioned to make Churchill the visionary who saw what others didn't, surrounded by men who weren't brave enough to see it through. It is not without truth. It is also not without strategic self-construction of a considerable order. The Commission's measured verdict gave him the space to write it. What the Commission did not ask deserves its own accounting. It did not call any of the nursing sisters who ran the Lemnos hospitals. It did not examine the weekly ordnance expenditure returns that documented the shell shortage from May through September of 1915. It did not question why the MEF's wire-cutting equipment was loaded at 18 feet depth in a vessel that would be sitting offshore while men were cut down at the wire it was supposed to clear. It did not interrogate the formula that calculated water provision at a rate 3 times higher than the peninsula's actual sources could supply. Stopford, whose conduct at Suvla represents the campaign's most specifically documented command failure, was not called as a witness. He wrote his own privately printed account of the Suvla operations after the war, defending his conduct, and was never publicly challenged in his lifetime. He died in 1929. The Commission had concluded proceedings without calling him. The final report described the campaign in language that has always struck me as being in an unusual relationship with the facts it purports to summarize. An operation conceived in good faith and executed with courage, which failed due to a combination of misjudgment, unforeseen resistance, and logistical constraint. This sentence is technically accurate. Churchill did conceive it in good faith. His faith in the strategic concept was genuine, if catastrophically unexamined. The men executed it with courage. That is beyond dispute. It failed, yes. The misjudgment, the unforeseen resistance, the logistical constraint, all real. But that sentence, in its measured cadences, describes the campaign at about the same altitude as you'd need to fly to make the Gulf of Mexico look like a puddle. From up there, it's all true. It's only when you get down to loading manifest line 4, row 17, and to the drip in the hospital register, and to the 23 attack cancelled entries in the brigade war diaries, that the word constraint starts to feel like it's standing in for something considerably more specific and considerably more preventable. The Commission was not a conspiracy. That needs to be said directly, because the easier and more satisfying story would be one in which powerful men deliberately shaped a verdict to protect themselves. The more accurate story is that the Commission operated through normal institutional mechanics, terms of reference set by the government under investigation, witnesses selected by a process that naturally inclined toward the powerful and the present, a mandate that examined the operational without reaching the systemic, and that those normal mechanics produced a verdict that was convenient, without anyone having made it convenient by design. That is, if anything, more uncomfortable than conspiracy. Conspiracy at least involves agency and intention. What the Dardanelles Commission produced came from institutional inertia and the ordinary limits of a framework that nobody had deliberately designed to fail. It just happened to produce findings that left almost everyone who had made the key decisions largely intact. Asquith, whose private diary for the period notes the Commission had done its work well, had not asked for that outcome specifically. He had simply created the conditions under which it was structurally probable. No Australian, no New Zealander, no Indian soldier was called before the Commission. The Dominion forces contributed over a quarter of the Allied casualties at Gallipoli. Their governments had funded, equipped, and transported those forces without any formal voice in their operational use. And when the time came to sit in a hearing room and answer questions about what had happened and why, the Commission heard from 168 witnesses, none of whom came from the nations that had borne that cost in blood and money, and had never been consulted about how it was spent. The Sydney Morning Herald editorial of the 9th of March 1917, the day after the interim report's publication, made the observation in one sentence. We are told that no one is to blame. This will surprise the mothers of 26,000 Australians. It is the most precise verdict on the Commission that the documentary record contains, and it was written not by a military historian or a government official, but by a newspaper editor in Sydney who had read the findings and done the arithmetic. Chapter 17. The Soul That Was Made from Losing. There is an inscription at ANZAC Cove. It is in Turkish and English. It reads, in the English translation, those heroes that shed their blood and lost their lives, you are now lying in the soil of a friendly country. Therefore, rest in peace. There is no difference between the Johnnies and the Mehmets to us, where they lie side by side here in this country of ours. You, the mothers, who sent their sons from faraway countries, wipe away your tears. Your sons are now lying in our bosom and are in peace. After having lost their lives on this land, they have become our sons as well. The name attached to this inscription is Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, the man who commanded the Ottoman defense of the Chunuk-Bair Ridge on the 8th of August 1915, and who later founded the Turkish Republic. Here is what the documentary record says about this inscription and its origins. The words appeared at ANZAC Cove, attributed to Ataturk, connected to a speech he gave in 1934. Exactly how the specific phrasing reached the form in which it is now carved into stone at Gallipoli is a question that historians, including researchers at The Guardian and at the University of Sydney, have examined with careful skepticism. The evidence for the Johnnies and Mehmets formulation, specifically, is contested. Some researchers believe the inscription as rendered represents a composite or later translation of remarks Ataturk made across several occasions, not a verbatim quote from a single speech. Others consider it substantially authentic. I am not in a position to resolve this debate definitively, and I don't think that resolution changes what matters most about the inscription, which is not whether every word of it can be traced to a single documented utterance, but what it means that two nations chose to put those words at that beach. The choosing is the historical fact. The choosing is what tells you what both nations needed. What Turkey and Australia chose to do with the same 9 months on the same peninsula is one of the more unusual acts of parallel national mythology in the modern world. Ataturk used Gallipoli as the foundation stone of the Turkish Republic's identity, the proof that the Turkish nation could defend its homeland against a superior imperial force, could produce the military and personal leadership that the moment required, could survive the threat to its existence and emerge as something new. The republic he founded in 1923 drew its legitimacy partly from the defense of the Dardanelles in 1915. The spirit of Çanakkale, the phrase used in Turkish public life, is not merely a commemoration of the campaign. It is a claim about what Turkey is and what it is capable of. The military campaign and the national founding are, in Turkish public consciousness, the same story told at different scales. Australia's construction is structurally different and, in some ways, more peculiar. What Australia built from Gallipoli was not a story of victory. It was a story of what men are like when they fail magnificently, and it costs them everything. The ANZAC legend, the specific qualities it attributes to Australian soldiers, egalitarianism, resourcefulness, contempt for class hierarchy, extraordinary performance in small unit action, laconic courage in the face of loss, is not a story of winning. It is a story of character revealed under conditions of defeat and inadequate supply and bad command, and everything going wrong in the most expensive possible way. A nation chose to found its identity not on a battle it won, but on a battle it lost, with what it decided was a particular quality of bearing. This is unusual. Most national foundation myths reach for triumph. Australia's reaches for something harder to name, a quality of being, visible under pressure, that the nation decided was more essentially its own than any victory could have been. Bean understood this when he was constructing it. The evidence is in the notebooks, in the editorial choices for the ANZAC book, in the preface to the official history. He was building something deliberately, and he knew he was building it. And what he was building was a story in which the measure of a people's character is not what they achieve, but how they behave when the plan falls apart, and the shells run out, and the water is half a pint per day, and the man in the next position who used to hum is gone. That story is real. It draws on real events and real men who genuinely did those things. It is also a selection from a much larger and messier archive. Both things are true simultaneously. The legend is not a lie, but it is not the whole truth either. It is a specifically chosen truth, and the choosing of it was an act of cultural creation that had consequences extending well past 1915. The dawn service at Gallipoli has grown from a small, primarily veterans and family gathering in the middle decades of the 20th century into something substantially different. The first formal service, attended by significant numbers of Australian and New Zealand visitors in Turkey, took place in the mid-1980s. By the centenary, in April of 2015, more than 10,000 people attended the dawn service on the peninsula itself, with considerably larger numbers at related commemorations across both countries. There is a specific thing that happens at that service: the pre-dawn darkness above the beach at ANZAC Cove, the cold coming off the Aegean, the reading of the names, that people who have attended it consistently describe as an experience outside the ordinary categories of commemoration or tourism. Something in the combination of the specific place and the specific darkness, and the specific act of speaking names over the water, produces something that resists easy description and that draws people back year after year. I think what it produces is the closest thing available to presence. Not to the past exactly, but to the fact that the past was real, was physical, had texture and weight, and a specific smell, and specific men who felt specific cold before specific dawns on that specific piece of ground. The Ottoman dead present a different problem, and one that the story of Gallipoli's memorialization has not fully resolved. At least 85,000 Turkish soldiers died in the campaign. The Allied graves are individually marked. Names, units, ages, the small biographical data that individual records provided. The vast majority of Ottoman soldiers are in mass graves, whose precise locations remain incompletely mapped. The asymmetry is not deliberate disrespect. It reflects the difference in administrative record-keeping capacity between a modern imperial bureaucracy and an Ottoman military under the pressures of a war it was simultaneously fighting on multiple fronts. But the asymmetry is visible at the peninsula. Individual Allied headstones in long, tended rows. Collective Ottoman memorials, marking ground under which the specific men are largely unidentifiable. The project to document and individually commemorate the Ottoman dead at Gallipoli remains ongoing and is the subject of work by Turkish and international archaeologists and archivists. It is not close to complete. The lone pine tree at the Australian War Memorial in Canberra is an Aleppo pine, the same species as the original tree on the Gallipoli Plateau that gave the battle its name. That original tree was destroyed in the fighting of August 1915. Seeds from a pine cone were brought back from the peninsula by a returning soldier and grown in Australia. From that growth, a seedling was planted at the memorial in 1934 by the Duke of Gloucester. From that tree, and from subsequent generations grown by nurseries from its seed, lone pine trees have been planted across Australia and New Zealand, at war memorials, in school grounds, in municipal parks. There are hundreds of them. They grow in Wagga Wagga and Ballarat and Wellington and Christchurch, in places where the families of men who went to that plateau and didn't come back have since had children and grandchildren who've never seen the Aegean. The chain of botanical descent from one pine tree on a contested ridge in 1915 is unbroken across more than a century. Seeds from the Gallipoli Plateau, grown in someone's garden, planted at a memorial, regrown and distributed again, and again, and again. The biology of memory, moving through soil. The Gallipoli Peninsula Peace Park and its 31 Allied cemeteries and memorials sit on ground that is simultaneously a national park, a joint UNESCO-advised heritage site, a location of profound national significance to 3 countries, and the site of some of the worst planned military operations in modern history. The planning failures are documented in archives across 4 countries. The courage is documented in the same archives, in different files, with different handwriting. Both are real. The peninsula holds them without apparent contradiction. The evidence of the planning failures, and the evidence of what men did anyway, in the same ground, sometimes in the same document. The question of how to look at both things at once, without resolving the discomfort by collapsing into either pure critique or pure reverence, is a question that the Gallipoli archive keeps posing, and that anyone who engages with it seriously has to answer for themselves. I have spent a long time in this material. What I keep returning to, past the loading manifests and the signal logs and the ordnance returns, is not an argument, but an observation. The Gallipoli campaign failed at every level at which it could be assessed institutionally. The strategic concept was inadequately developed. The planning was inadequate. The logistics were inadequate. The command was, with some distinguished exceptions, inadequate. The medical provision was inadequate. The ammunition was insufficient. The maps were in London. The minesweepers couldn't hold station against the current. And the men, the Mehmets and the Johnnies, the farm labourers and the Wellington infantrymen and the nursing sisters and the stretcher bearer with the donkey, were placed into all of that inadequacy and asked to make something from it. They made what they could. Some of them made it into a national story that has lasted 111 years and shows no sign of losing its hold. Some of them made it into unsent letters about wheat. Some of them made it into nothing at all. Their names on a memorial wall facing the sea they came from, on a ridge they briefly held and lost before the morning was gone. That's all. That is the whole of it. There is no resolution that makes the arithmetic balance. There is only the record, the specific weight of specific documents, and the peninsula in the early morning, with the water coming in off the Aegean, and the names being read in the dark.